Arc 7, Chapter 94, Determination for the Sake of Whom? A roar, like distant thunder, shook Beatrice's consciousness as she closed her eyelids. Beatrice, such an unpleasant sound, I suppose. The little girl's faint whispering brought back memories of hearing similar sounds over and over again in her mind. 400 years ago, in the Age of Witches, during a time of constant warfare, it was not uncommon for large numbers of people to clash with each other, exchange blows, and fight for their lives. Beatrice was not intimately familiar with the battlefield. She was born and raised in the mansion of her mother, Echidna, a place free from human conflict. Even though the battles were far below her notice, they were still aggravating. As time passed, she spent 400 years with the book entrusted to her, during which the world outside was far from the madness of those days, although it could still be turbulent. Yet, this once far distant madness was now close at hand, that being, a struggle for countless lives all around the imperial capital. I am worried. I am anxious. I know how you feel, Shu. I guess you and the others should be leaving too? Oh. Wow. You. That's no good. Our job is to wait. We are waiting. Beatrice, endeavoring to close her eyes and conserve energy, overheard the exchange. What could be heard were the voices of children she had become quite familiar with over the past few days, Schult, Utakata, and Louis Arneb. Beatrice and the other children were settled behind the main camp, where they waited in a tent that overlooked the battlefield from a hill, and although it sounded good to say that they protected the rear of the camp, at least Beatrice knew that this was just a pretense not to be expected of them. Normally, it would be wise to leave non-combatants like children behind in the fortress city. Similarly, the non-combatants among the residents who had relocated from the demon city with Yorna Mishikia and were unable to survive the battle, stayed away from the front lines and focused on cooperative support like logistics instead. The reason why children did not do the same was because of their guardians. Priscilla, a skirmish is one thing, however, it would be pitiable to keep them at a distance when it comes to the big stage. The fringes of the battlefield shall be acceptable to me. Wherever you may be, you shall not mistake my brilliance. My Zelda, Utakata is one of the Shudrak. Cowards who turn their back on the battlefield and the hunting grounds are not fit to be a member of the Shudrakian people. Naturally, they'll be taken to the battlefield. These were the respective statements of Schult and Utakata's guardians, opinions that could not be dissuaded since Schult and Utakata were both highly determined. Both may have spoken from different morals and beliefs, but Beatrice had no right to interfere as long as the parties involved were in agreement for the time being. To be honest, as a great spirit, Beatrice had not been pleased with the situation in which she and these children were being treated as a package. Nevertheless, since everyone in the camp had their own role to play, it was only logical that Beatrice was assigned here considering how restrained her actions were. The role entrusted to her was Louis, U.O. Like Schult and Utakata, Louis had also been ordered to stay behind in the tent. Beatrice, except her treatment was distinctly different from that of other young children. Unlike with Schult and Utakata, there was no obvious guardian, however, the main focus was keep an eye on a certain person. Of course, that was the Sin Archbishop. The danger would never diminish, no matter what those who knew her in the Empire said. So, unlike the other children, Louis was the only one they had no choice, they could not leave her by her lonesome. Otto, currently, she is a bomb with the least inclination to make a move. Beatrice-chan, I do not wish to burden you too much, but please keep an eye on her. We cannot tell Emilia Summer or Garfield about this, at least we need to remain level-headed, had been Otto's statement before he decided to participate in the full-scale rebellion. It may have been a precaution so that Beatrice would not be discouraged by the helplessness of having no role to play and staying in wait to conserve her energy, but it was also an unsettling statement because she started losing the ground under her feet. The fact that he purposely tried to keep a calm look on his face was unsettling. Both Petra and Frederica had the same concerns, so perhaps they could have done something about it. In any case. Beatrice, you shouldn't fidget around so much, in fact. Calm down, I suppose. Utakata, Bay, is awake. Beatrice, Betty has been awake the whole time, in fact. Also, that name you used is unpleasant, I suppose. It kind of makes one feel like they're being a cambered, in fact, one. There were no beds in the camp tent to lie on, and no lap of Emilia nor Petra to borrow either. Consequently, Utakata's lips pouted at Beatrice, who had had her eyes closed as she sat on a simple chair. Opening her eyes thinly at the reaction, she looked at the three restless people in the camp. Schult was anxious, Utakata couldn't handle the fighting spirit, and it was hard to tell what was going in Louis's head as she impatiently bounced her shoulders at each sound of the battle. Beatrice, Looking at the behavior alone, there appeared to be nothing suspicious about Louis. A child who was simply hypersensitive to changes in her surroundings, other carefree people, who were unaware of the threat of gluttony, would have inadvertently regarded them as a normal child. But that was not the case for Beatrice. Beatrice, Emilia and everyone else are doing their best to help Subaru and the others, I suppose. The reason Emilia and her group were willing to intervene in this rebellion and fight for their lives, despite having no obligation to do so, was that they were likely to find their friends, Subaru and Rem, there. If Beatrice was unable to fight alongside them, she would at least be able to cut down on distractions by keeping a close eye on Louis. So, Beatrice braced herself through shallow breathing and... Louis, you? Beatrice, you, what are you up to, in fact? Beatrice's lips pursed, as a small hand caressed her head. She glanced at Louis, who was looking at her with lowered eyebrows. For a moment, her body stiffened at the risk of being touched by Louis's hand, but she did not feel threatened by her, nor did Louis make any gesture to snatch Beatrice's name away. As far as Beatrice knew, gluttony required calling out the other person's name and eating it in order to activate the authority, but Louis' mouth never even uttered the right sounds to begin with. Of course, if Louis only required awareness, there was still a possibility for her to activate the authority, so Beatrice was nervous about Louis moving the hand that touched her head to her mouth. If Louis ever showed the slightest gesture to eat Beatrice's name, then... Utakata, Bay, your face is scary. Do you still hate Lou? Beatrice, what a way to comment on Betty's adorable face, I suppose. Besides, Betty does not hate this girl, in fact. Despising would be more fitting, I suppose. At the sight of Beatrice glaring at Louis, Utakata pushed up both of her own eyes with her fingers while saying her face isn't adorable, and Beatrice let her true feelings come out in the end. So yes, I find myself hating Louis. Not just Louis, but the Sin Archbishop of Gluttony in general. Everything that caused Subaru and the others to suffer. Beatrice, regretful, in fact. For the Emilia camp, and above all for Subaru, gluttony's biggest victim had been none other than Rem. Watching Subaru suffer over the girl who was indefinitely asleep, made Beatrice constantly regret the time wasted before she had been contracted with him, when she was indifferent to the world around her. Wondering what could have been. If Beatrice had opened up earlier and shown a willingness to cooperate with Subaru and the others, things might have turned out differently. Not allowing the White Whale, the witch cult, and the like to do whatever they wanted, Subaru would not have ended up displaying such a never-ending expression of sorrow beside Rem as she continued to sleep. That was why she decided to never let Subaru suffer like that again, and stay by his side for the rest of his life, yet here she was. After being separated from Subaru, she could not help Emilia and the other members of the group to the fullest extent because she was forced to conserve energy. The meaning of her existence was in tatters. Schult, Beatrice-chan, you can't talk like that to Louis Summer. Beatrice, Betty doesn't feel sorry for her, I suppose. You're being imprudent to begin with, in fact. Why do you refer to Betty as Chan when the others are called Summer, I suppose? You lack respect, in fact. Schult, I'm terribly sorry, Beatrice-chan. Picking up a sense of danger, Schult interjected as she stared at him. How did Schelt, who did not waver despite being terrified, see Beatrice? Could it be that he thought she was a little girl since she had been asleep all this time? Beatrice, in any case, do not fatigue Betty, I suppose. The whole purpose of being left here is to prevent everyone here from doing anything unnecessary, in fact, as much as a pain it is to do exactly that. Louis, you. Beatrice, it is much better than letting you run amok, I suppose. Beatrice grabbed Louis's hand resting on her head and made the startled Louis sit down in the chair right next to her. In the end, she decided to hold on to Louis's hand and not let go of it. Beatrice, you too, in fact. Schelt, stop moping around, and Utakata, if you do not have anything to do, just take care of your bow, I suppose. So? ? It appears that there is no need for me to interject. Beatrice, what? As she was dealing with the restless children, she suddenly heard a calm voice enter the camp tent. When she looked, she saw a man with curly hair, Zika Osman, peeking inside. Beatrice furrowed her brow at his appearance since he was supposed to be at the main camp, commanding alongside Abel. Utakata, Z. We've been busy, but now you're here. It's time for you and the others. Beatrice, you wish, in fact. But what business do you have, I suppose? Zika, my apologies Miss Utakata, but it's not your time. However, there is a possibility that we may move the camp at a later date, so I thought I would let you know in advance. Schelt, moving the camp, you say? Zika's intellectual, round eyes made Schelt tilt his head. Zika nodded yes in response, as he pointed at the battlefield behind him. Zika, currently, we are devoting our forces to breaching the city walls, but once a bastion has been opened, we will venture forth to the Crystal Palace in the imperial capital. At that time, the commander must also go to the front. Beatrice, Abel does not seem capable of fighting, in fact. He is safer in the rear, concentrating on giving orders, I suppose. Zika, you are right. However, then the troops will not follow us. In the case of us paving the way for His Excellency the Emperor, then no one would allow him to sit on the throne. Beatrice, such bothersome national ideals, in fact. The fundamental principle of the Wallachian Empire was that the people of the empire must be strong. However, this apparently applied even to a leader taking over the nation. If the supreme leader did not possess any strength to boast of, they would be overthrown by their subordinates in the blink of an eye. Zika, yes, it's bothersome. But that is what our homeland is about. Shaking his head gently, a slightly wry smile appeared on Zika's mouth. It was hard for Beatrice to discern what emotions were being mixed in there. He may not have been entirely comfortable with it, but neither was he negative about it. Schelt, Zika-sama, could it be you are heading into battle? Utakata, Z. Suddenly, beside Beatrice, who was watching Zika's lips, Schelt asked him a question, while Utakata called out to him in a quiet voice. At the children's gaze, Zika raised his eyebrows slightly, then. Zika, as you have guessed, I will also be participating. Even though we outnumber them, we are still at a disadvantage in terms of generals below general second class, so we have to change that situation. Beatrice, why is that, I suppose? Zika, Pardon. Beatrice, why do you bother to come here, in fact? In your position, you could have just ordered your men to do it, I suppose. What purpose is there in you showing up in front of Betty and the others, in fact? Zika, oh, that's what you mean. If one was about to head into battle, one would want to be even more focused at this point in time. Nevertheless, Zika showed up at a camp tent full of children, who could not be left behind on this battlefield. When he was asked his reason, Zika put up an embarrassed smile. Zika, there are only men at the main camp since the women of Shudrak are also on the front line. If we are in need of encouragement before going into battle, only women can make you truly exhilarated. Beatrice, huh? Schelt, I see. Certainly, Utakata-sama and Louis-sama are here, as well as Beatrice-chan. Hearing his unexpected answer, Beatrice's eyes widened. In contrast to Beatrice's reaction, Schult looked convinced, and Utakata nodded with her short arms folded. Then she turned to the astonished Beatrice and said, "Utakata, give it up. It's been like this from the start." Beatrice, it was a big mistake to think this guy was the only normal one, I suppose. The signs were there. For some reason, he was called a coward, and instead of trying to argue about it, he was proud of it. However, there was no reason for her to get deeply involved, so she just didn't say anything. As a result, Zika's eccentricities ended up on display at the last minute, with it resulting in an awkward situation. Zika, besides, if you are aware of what is behind you, you have a better chance of not getting lost. Beatrice, you have a family, in fact. Zika, a mother and numerous sisters. But when I joined this side, their position became much worse. It's a terrible misfortune for my family. Zika was originally a general on the side of the empire as a general second class. Since he defected, it was only natural that his family would be affected. Zika was prepared for that and still considered it worthwhile to choose this side. Beatrice wondered if Abel was worthy of this choice, but no one but the man himself knew the reasons. She was simply curious. "Beatrice, what is it you fight for, I suppose?" Zika, Beatrice, you are not supposed to be like those guys who fight for the sake of fighting, in fact. Why is that, I suppose? A simple soldier may have been fine with this, which made the Wallachian Empire such a terrifying place since many of its warriors were of a similar mindset, but that was not the case for a general, much less Zika. At Beatrice's perception, Zika raised a thick eyebrow in slight contemplation, then. "Zika, of course, it is for the sake of the future of the Wallachian Empire for which I place my faith and to which I owe my loyalty." With a strong voice, he replied, and then he continued with, "Of course. Zika, I am a coward, after all, so I doubt I could resist. So, may I ask you, Miss Beatrice?" Beatrice, what, in fact? Zika, the obvious, the blessing of a lovely maiden. As he said this, Zika pulled out the sword from his side and presented it to Beatrice. After narrowing her eyes and looking down at the proffered item, Beatrice sighed and. "Beatrice, for the record, Betty does not know much about the proper etiquette, I suppose. Zika, in such matters the feelings are what's most important. As long as the giver and the receiver's hearts are in tune with each other, the etiquette is of no significance." Beatrice, since when are our hearts in tune with each other, in fact? Good grief. Muttering, Beatrice accepted the sword. In front of Beatrice, Zika reverently dropped his head and kneeled down. His seriousness reminded Beatrice of a ceremony she had attended one day when Subaru was knighted by Emilia, and she followed her example. With the sword she received, she tapped each of the kneeling Zika's shoulders once. "Beatrice, to see this through properly, I suppose. For the sake of no one else's but your own wish, Zika, as you command." At Beatrice's blessing, Zika looked up in somber acknowledgement. He sheathed the sword returned to him by Beatrice and looked towards Utakata and the others by his side. Seeing the look in his eyes, Utakata called out, "Utakata, you is a Shudrakian warrior, so we don't do things like bay. A send-off in the style of a warrior." As she said that, Utakata pulled out the knife from her waist. With the knife made from the tusk of a beast, she cut a thin slice of skin from her palm to cause a small bleeding. Beside Schultz's pained face, Utakata gently pressed her blood-soaked palm against the armor Zika wore, marking it with her handprint. Utakata, Shudrakian blood, the blood of strong warriors. Make Z strong, too. Zika, with gratitude. Schultz, well, I can't think of anything like Beatrice-chan or Utakata-sama, so I'll cheer for you. Hooray! Hooray! Zika-sama. I'll be there. In response to Utakata's action, Schultz also shouted a loud cheer to Zika. Zika accepted it with a smile and stood up in place. And then. Zika, oh. Louis, oh, Louis slipped out of Beatrice's hands and hugged Zika's waist as he stood up. Zika was startled by the little girl's embrace, as he patted her on the shoulder with a frown. In Beatrice's eyes, Louis' behavior was an indication of positive feelings towards Zika. The fact that she could not control her at a moment's notice was also because there was no sign of unpleasantness. Zika Osman, as I depart for battle. Please, remain in good health. Schult, may you have success in battle. Breaking free from Louis' embrace, Zika exited the tent with a cheerful look on his face. Schult waved his hand, while Utakata narrowed her eyes as they watched him go. As Beatrice watched Zika's back grow distant, she understood that he headed into battle fully prepared to die. Just like it was the case 400 years ago. When war was happening in faraway places, however, there were frequent visitors to her mother's mansion, and they all sought the witch's knowledge and cooperation. All with a strong desire to improve bad situations. That being noted, it was up to every single person to realize whatever advice one received from the knowledgeable. After seeing the possibilities within the future of her mother's advice, many turned their backs on the mansion and headed toward their own futures. Zika's back appeared to be just like one's from that time. Beatrice, you. Louis, you? Watching Zika leave, Beatrice addressed Louis. Turning around, Louis stared back at Beatrice with her already wide eyes becoming more wide upon her childish face. Completely thoughtless, no, that would be a mistake. Yet, looking at her face, which seemed to be devoid of any plan, she asked. Beatrice, which side are you really on, in fact? With a full swing, the pair of ice swords struck her chest, and Madeline, her eyes wide open, flew a great deal backwards. As Emilia chased after her, she called out thank you. To the beings that prevented Madeline's movement, to the sculptures of Natsuki Subaru made from ice. To fight alongside the 7 soldiers of ice was a tactic Emilia had developed as a last resort when she had taken Volcanica's trial at Pleiades' watchtower. On her own, she may have lacked manpower. Without time to waste on her vague apprehensions, these ice soldiers were the result brought about by her confidence that I've been watching Subaru closely. As for an official name, she intended on asking Subaru to provide one, once she showed them to him. Emilia, so for now, just do your best as soldiers. There was no direct reply to Emilia's words, but one by one, the 7 ice soldiers pumped their fists up, giving a response to Emilia's cheers. While she thought of that reassuringly, Emilia and the ice soldiers drew near Madeline, who had been blown away. It probably looked just like a scene where 8 people were bullying a small girl, but, Madeline, if one were to see the howling Madeline swinging her arms, blowing away the upper bodies of 2 ice soldiers, such a leisurely impression probably would not come to mind. Even without her flying winged blade, Madeline's dragon claws and superhuman strength were exceedingly frightening. Emilia's ice had been made hard and firm, and even if it was not to the extent of iron, it was at least as hard as a strong boulder. If one were to carelessly strike it barehanded, it was hard enough to reasonably break their hand instead. So easily had it been destroyed by Madeline's fingers merely wrapping themselves around it. Emilia, I'm sorry. The soldiers resembling Subaru were destroyed, and Emilia could hear the screams of Beatrice in her mind. Apologizing to the Beatrice inside her head, Emilia remained vigilant for Madeline's counteroffensive. While she was vigilant, she chose not to back down, but instead to continue stepping forward. Emilia, yeah. Terra tilde. Brandishing a pair of ice swords, she proceeded to rain down attacks on Madeline, who had not been able to fully halt the momentum of the initial strike, although, when the pair of swords struck the shoulders of Madeline, her arms widespread, they shattered into pieces. The tough skin of the dragonkin remained unyielding to the sword slashes of ice. She needed to use even heavier attacks. Emilia, with this. The shattered pair of swords became shards of ice, and what Emilia had made to replace them was a large ice mallet. As Emilia brandished it, 2 of the kneeling ice soldiers linked arms to create a foothold before her eyes, then she stepped on that and jumped up high. Gaining speed immediately after, Emilia drove the ice mallet into Madeline with enough force to make her own body spin vertically. Madeline, HK. Without any defense, Madeline received Emilia's blow directly on her head. Landing before Madeline, who had turned downwards as of the impact, Emilia used the recoil to put power into a second strike. Emilia, huh? As soon as she gripped it tightly, the handle of the ice mallet shattered. No, it was not just the handle, the entire thing had been destroyed. The ice mallet that had struck Madeline's head was the one unable to bear the opponent's hardness. Emilia widened her eyes upon seeing that, and simultaneously, the claws below her eyes rose sharply. The moment the claws moved within the edges of her vision, a small shield of ice intercepted its trajectory. Emilia, ow! However, the ice shield was smashed at that instant, and cries of pain erupted. After having poured energy into her body at an earned moment, the side of her head was slashed by the claw tips, and at the slight impact of her silver hair being grazed, Emilia's vision greatly and violently shook. Nevertheless, the attack did not end with that. Madeline, do not mock this dragon. The howling Madeline raised her claws overhead. The wind of destruction that followed turned over the surface of the ground. She promptly flew backwards as to avoid the claws, but the wind that arrived afterwards struck her, and Emilia's body was flicked away, having been hit in kind. Engulfed by the ground turning over like waves, Emilia's body bounced, being blown away. Emilia, roo-roo-roo-you. With eyes just like those of a dragon or a snake, Madeline caught up, and raised her flying winged blade overhead. As it swung down, it accelerated with aim for Emilia's lower back. In an instant, Emilia funneled power into her abdomen to try and withstand the oncoming strike, but she immediately concluded that it was something that she must not be hit by. Reaching out her hand, she tightly grasped a cold and solid sensation. Emilia, Her arm was jerked up with force, and Emilia's body, now having been pulled up, escaped the trajectory of the flying winged blade. The one which had done that was an ice soldier who caught up to the blown-away Emilia as fast as it could, and pulled her arm while diving into a forward somersault. The ice soldier forcibly pulled Emilia up, and heaved her away just after. Emilia's body spun around as it was sent flying, and in her field of vision, the ice soldier was overpowered and shattered by the flying winged blade which she had evaded. Emilia, Subaru. It was not Subaru, but Emilia had called out with the feeling that Subaru had received harm. Catching up to Emilia, who had again been sent flying, was an ice soldier different to the one which had been destroyed. Without a pause, she was thrown over to the next ice soldier, received, then thrown over, and was escaping from the dragonkin. Madeline, enough. Quit messing around. With an angry bellow and a flash, the solid earth fissured where it had been stepped on by Madeline, her face red, and with her firm foothold, she threw the flying winged blade with a tremendous and ferocious vigor. The flying winged blade revolved at a velocity so intense and extreme that to the eye, it did not appear as anything but a disc. It was a disc that cut down anything and everything in its path, and clad in a strong wind, it approached Emilia. Emilia, I'm counting on you. Before that could reach her, the ice soldiers, receiving Emilia's voice, rushed out one by one. They lined up in single file, and wedged themselves into the gap between the flying Emilia and the disc flying towards her. All of them took an ice weapon in their hands, and used them to fight against the flying winged blade. As a result, the sounds of ice shattering at high speed chained together, and the Subaru ice soldiers were completely annihilated. However, just before each Subaru was shattered, they each landed as much of a hit as they could onto the flying winged blade. The change in the danger of the flying winged blade was something that ordinary people would not know, but that Revolution had very slightly, just a little, a wee bit, weakened. She felt like it had weakened. Emilia, It weakened. She declared it in a loud voice, and it truly appeared like it had become like that. Using the leeway that the ice Cerberus had made for her, Emilia equipped her legs with thick-soled ice boots, placed the two arms of her airborne body on the ground, and met the oncoming flying winged blade with her two legs. Emilia was well aware that legs were just a little stronger than arms. Emilia, ya. Firmly clenching her teeth, Emilia extended her knees using all of her might. The direct impact from the flying winged blade delivered a shock to Emilia's entire body, and from head to toe, all the bones in her body were creaking. Firmly withstanding, she would withstand it to the end. Fully extending her legs, which were experiencing resistance, even while crevices started to form in her ice boots, Emilia's kick shot the flying winged blade up into the sky. Madeline, wah! It seemed like it was beyond Madeline's expectations for it to have been stopped, so she raised her voice in surprise. Facing that, Emilia got up and leapt, reaching her hand out to the flying winged blade which had been kicked up. She tightly grasped the edge of the flying winged blade, and into that arm, she poured a considerable amount of strength. Emilia, this time. I'm returning the favor. The flying winged blade was much heavier than it looked, but Emilia was also someone who possessed indomitable power. It was difficult with a single arm, so she twisted her body in order to change to a two-handed grip. From there, with all her might, she resolutely flung the flying winged blade away with a hiya. Madeline, HK. Seeing the flying winged blade flung away, Madeline widened her eyes. Receiving the vigor of rapid spinning, the flying winged blade soared. Although it paled in comparison to when Madeline had thrown it, the dangerous weapon still cut through the wind as it flew. Flying, towards an incorrect direction, it had flown away amazingly. Emilia, Madeline, just what is your intention? Emilia, I may have messed up. She was trying to return the favor and deal damage, but she was completely unable to handle the flying winged blade well, so it had flown away. On the forehead of Madeline, who had been angered by that, a vein had begun to bulge very quickly. Immediately after, Madeline's cheeks stiffened, and she stepped forward in order to chase after the flying winged blade which had flown away. However, Emilia, that's a no-no. Then, Emilia, her hands outstretched, created a wall of ice ahead of where Madeline was proceeding. The wall of ice erected from the ground was thick, and she had also made it fairly long horizontally. Going around it or jumping over it, neither feat would be managed so easily. She had not been able to utilize the flying winged blade very well, but it would be dangerous if Madeline were to wield it. It was not as though that was her aim, but she thought that the current situation of it being at a distance was the most beneficial. Emilia, I'm sorry, but I can't let you retrieve that weapon. If you are to continue, then it shall be without that. Madeline, Emilia, if you surrender, I will properly accept that. Actually, if you do that, it would be really helpful. What will you do? Will you continue? Emilia posed a question to the back of Madeline, who cast her eyes downward as she faced the wall of ice. If Madeline, who had lost her weapon, were to surrender, that would be the best scenario. In order to get Madeline to believe she was at a disadvantage, Emilia once again created the Natsuki subrus of ice, which had once been annihilated, in her surroundings, and she crossed her arms as she stood. 8 against 1, this time, in a state without her weapon, Madeline was in a much more unfavorable position. With all this, then, Emilia was enthusiastically thinking as such. But alas! Madeline, why do you think that I, the dragon, would give up? Muttering, Madeline gently placed her hand on the wall of ice before her eyes. Gazing at that gesture, Emilia reflexively caught her breath with an ah. With a crack, the very moment that high-pitched noise reverberated, the entirety of the gigantic ice wall began to fissure with the pattern of a spiderweb. The origin was naturally Madeline's palm, so the fissures that extended across the entire ice wall were centered on her. Emilia had gone all out when creating that ice wall. The hardness and density of the ice were just as previously mentioned, and even though it was not something that could be destroyed easily, Emilia, Madeline, when talking to you humans, this dragon's head gets all weird. You, that healer, that senile old fool, all of you are in this dragon's way. Emilia, Turning her back, without revealing her downcast face, mixed into Madeline's trembling voice were complex and intricate emotions. Anger, sorrow, and all sorts of other things. It seemed just as if Madeline herself did not understand which of her own emotions was the strongest. What she had spoken of were those who were in her way. Of course, Emilia understood that she herself was in a position confronting Madeline. Outside of Emilia, the ones she called a healer and a senile old fool, did they also happen to be her enemies? As a dragonkin, as an ally of the Empire, Madeline opposed Emilia and the others, and went on a rampage. Emilia, Madeline, for what purpose do you fight? Madeline, At the question, Madeline swayed her head to a tilt. Her two black horns at a slant, Madeline's golden eyes stared at Emilia from above her shoulders. Though she was getting a horrifying, blood-curdling sensation, Emilia did not avert her gaze. Going against the instinct to turn away, Emilia fixed her eyes on Madeline. Thinking about it now, she should have done it sooner. She should have tried to talk like this from the very start. Both this time and last time, even though Madeline, who was blocking in the way, had been brimming with fighting spirit, Emilia had gotten caught up in it, and suddenly begun an attack. But Emilia, if we can talk with each other, then I really think that talking is the best scenario. Madeline, why do you fight? For the sake of whom? Madeline, what about you? Why? Emilia, Wondering if it would really be necessary to say that, Emilia realized that Madeline was trying to continue. The fact that she had responded with that was something very difficult for Emilia. The reason that Madeline had given Emilia something she must speak of, that unfortunate occurrence, was something which Emilia could not be prepared for. If Emilia were to refuse her dialogue, and if the result of that refusal was claws being swung, Emilia would wield an ice weapon as expected, and would need to oppose Madeline. In that manner, upon Emilia's cheeks stiffening. Madeline, why do you oppose? Opposing this dragon, there is no chance for victory. Emilia, Madeline, why? Why do all of you oppose? That was the question posed from Madeline's side. Unknowing of Emilia's circumstances, she responded as such to words she should have brushed off. On the contrary, being questioned about that, Emilia cautioned her own slow mind. She thought she could not respond with anything. However, it was not like that. Just as Madeline had said, if Emilia could not get Madeline to speak, then she herself should be the one to open up her heart first. After all, this battlefield was harsh, so Emilia prioritized the things she herself wanted to do, and the things she herself wanted to say. But even so, at just this moment, for what reason did she think to try and have good manners? Why did she fight? For what reason was she here? The answer to all of that was, Emilia, I came here to meet my treasured knight. No, everybody's treasured knight. Saying that, Emilia touched the shoulder of one of the ice soldiers, the imitations of Subaru, directly next to her. She thought she had made them well. She had replicated his hairstyle and tracksuit quite proficiently. Though, no matter how well they imitated him, Subaru's reliability could not be reproduced. His positive words, his reliable attitude, his kindness which gave her delight, just about everything. Natsuki Subaru-ness, just thinking about it made Emilia's chest grow pleasantly warm, and it was impossible for anyone except the person in question to possess. Emilia, he's a really treasured person. That person, and the girl who should be with that person, many people are awaiting their return, so that's why I am here. For that purpose, I'm trying my very best. Madeline, Emilia, the reason I fight, that's it. Madeline, what about you? She probably had someone, or something, which she wanted to protect. If that was the case, they could make a promise to not hurt the other's treasured thing, and they could probably stop fighting. Subaru and Rem, it would open the path to reach the two who she wished to bring back. Those hopes and wishes that Emilia held were. Madeline, Borleroy to Meglif. Emilia, that name is? Madeline, that was the name of the man who was to be this dragon's darling. He is this dragon's entire reason for fighting. They were betrayed by Madeline, who fought for the sake of someone who had already been lost. Emilia, hearing her voice lose all spirit, Emilia caught her breath. She was unable to find the right words to say at the spur of the moment, and because she was not close enough to reach her hand out, Emilia could not make it in time. For that reason, Madeline, kill the man who killed Borleroy. That is this dragon's long-standing desire. A violent sound rang out, as Madeline crushed the ice wall with her grip. There was no other way to describe it than crushed it with her grip. She tightened her grip with the hand placed on the wall, and from there, the destruction spread throughout the entire ice wall. It had been shattered in one fell swoop. Taking the flying winged blade present on the other side, Madeline looked to the figure facing her once more, and while Emilia digested those bitter feelings, she and the ice soldiers headed towards Madeline. Having lost someone dear to her, the Dragonkin girl was desperate to fill the empty hole in her chest. Stepping forward to chase her, that was the moment. Madeline, Metzorai. Facing the sky as she bathed in the fragments of the shattered ice wall, Madeline cried out. As though it was ripping apart the sparkling ice shards as they danced down, the loud voice echoed throughout the sky of skies. Hearing that, Emilia's eyes grew wide, and she looked to the sky. The sound Madeline had made, Emilia had heard it once before. Her lips had previously spun that sound, and at the time when it was spun, at that time, there was a really big attack. A white corona rained down incessantly, and mowing down the fortress city in the blink of an eye. The very terrain had been altered. Since Emilia was together with Priscilla at that time, they were somehow able to defend against it. Supposing the same thing happened here, Emilia wondered if she would be able to stand a chance against it on her own. That would be very difficult. Above the head of the panicked Emilia, the same thing did not occur. However, despite the fact that the same thing had not occurred, Emilia could not greatly rejoice. After all, I am Mazoya. In accordance with the voice of mine dear child, I shalt become the wind from the heavenly skies. Spreading its wings of pure white, a body of colossal scale, clad in the very essence of an overcast sky, the cloud dragon Mazoya, invoked by Madeline Ischart, swooped down upon the skies of the imperial capital. Arc 7, Chapter 95, Enemies on all bastions. At that moment, everyone on the battlefield caught sight of a being clad in clouds of pure white, having descended to above the ground. Excessively magnificent and majestic, the transcendent being that, from the foundations of its existence, was in a completely different dimension from worthless mediocrity. Everyone understood that with just a glance. That's a dragon. Widening his emerald green eyes, Garfield muttered beside the crumbled rampart. After his fight to the death with Kafma Irelux ended, while taking rough breaths with his shoulders, just as he looked around searching for the battlefield where his next duty would be, that had happened. In the distance, a colossal presence that made it look like the sky itself had fallen, had appeared on the battlefield where the most fighting spirits were flaring up in this empire, at the decisive battle on the bastion which had been frozen white. Garfield, Emilia Summer. Possessing a gait with absurd capacity, using her mana without needing to be subtle, taking the heat away from the world was undoubtedly the work of Emilia getting serious. The 5 bastions of the ramparts, if she was fighting an enemy guarding one of them, their opponent would be a divine general or a being of equal strength. Even at the minimum, that opponent would be on the same level as Kafma, even though that alone was enough for them to be an enemy who did not want to make Emilia fight. It had been particularly absurd that the additional fighting force that had appeared there was a mythical being. Garfield, did Flying Dragon General call him down? Shit, I gotta get her out of there right now. Gnashing his fangs, Garfield decided in his heart to shift battlefields. Emilia fighting, and letting Emilia fight, was simply not connected. Emilia herself would probably object, but letting her fight was a distressing decision for the camp. Originally, Emilia should have been in a position overseeing everything from a place without concern for injury. Garfield, my amazing self, wouldn't be able to face Captain. It was natural that Emilia would not want to leave the whole situation to someone else. He thought that narrow-sightedness, in a good sense, and thoughtfulness were desirable traits. But he could not permit all of that, and could not let her do what she wanted. It went without saying that Garfield was a military officer of the Emilia camp, and his role was to repel all the sparks that rained down on the camp, and defeat the enemies standing in their way. Garfield, Closing his eyes, Garfield quietly ascertained his own condition. He got severely wounded from his battle with Kafma, his entire body had been mangled, his insides had been spread outwards, he had burned his own body to kill the insects that had nested there, and yet Garfield was still alive and well. It was a situation where the only thing he had to boast about was that he was alive and well. Garfield, it may be exaggerating to say I'm full of life. But I'll do it. Even now, he was absorbing power through the soles of his feet planted on the earth, and through invoking healing magic with all of his might, Garfield's body healed at a furious pace, both inside and out. Normally, this would be a load on the body that could potentially reduce his lifespan, but the events in the Watergate city forced Garfield to break out of his shell, both physically and mentally. Though it was not visible, Garfield tore through the shell that was certainly there, and stood tall. With the steam rising from his many bloody wounds, as if his body were truly blazing hot, Garfield settled his resolve to face the dragon in the distance. Garfield, everyone. My amazing self tore down the rampart. Hurry the fuck up and get your asses in there. Opening his mouth, Garfield howled at the group of rebels who were watching him from afar. They were the group that had challenged Kafma before Garfield, and were mowed down. Although a considerable number of them, including those wounded but supported by their comrades, should still be capable of functioning as a fighting force, but they had all stayed away from Garfield and Kafma's battlefield, and remained motionless even after the battle had been concluded. There were those that might say that this was just because they were overwhelmed by Garfield and Kafma's battle. However, it was not just that. You're the one who broke through the rampart. So, you should be the first to go through. Garfield, Brave warrior, we respect your might. No one, whoever they may be, would dare to desecrate that. One of the Centaur people had thus gallantly answered Garfield's words. Having defeated Kafma, Garfield deserved to be the first to climb over the ramparts. That was why they had stopped, and fixedly waited for him to cross over the rampart. It seemed that this was not his opinion alone, but the opinion of everyone who saw the duel just prior. Those who started the battle for selfish reasons, hidden within them was the historic warrior's pride. It seemed that in their judgment, Garfield's way of fighting had been radiant. Their consideration, in and of itself, was heartwarming, but... Garfield, my bad, but there's somewhere my fucking amazing self has gotta go. This ain't the whipfrock who came back. It's the one over there. Garfield jerked his chin towards the white dragon reigning over the distant sky. In both the Pleiades watchtower and the fortress city of Garrel, there had been opportunities to meet one. Garfield had continued to let them get away due to his poor timing, and he was finally in a position to take on a dragon. It was not that he wanted to fight it. It was an opponent that must be fought. Rebels, after seeing Garfield's gesture, the rebels also gasped at the sight of the white dragon. It was a matter of course, but they had also become aware of its existence. Fearing that, though it was the unusual spirit of the imperial citizens to not bend their knees or hang their heads, whether or not they would challenge, it was a different matter. Garfield would challenge it. Therefore, Garfield, I'll leave crossing the rampart to you guys. If the rebels crossed over the collapsed rampart and surged into the imperial capital, the situation would change. If all 5 bastions were defended by the greatest military powers of the empire, then there was also the possibility that the defenses were thin in the area around Emperor Vincent Wallachia, who should be in the Crystal Palace. There was a possibility that a literal decisive blow could be fired through the big hole that he had opened in this rampart. Garfield, that's why, After handing over the vanguard of the attack on the imperial capital to the rebels, Garfield would begin his battle with the White Menace. Then, it had happened when he had been about to embark towards the bastion where the dragon was. Garfield shuddered as all the hairs on his body stood on end. Garfield, HK. Free from obstructive thoughts. He was free from obstructive thoughts. Without hesitation, without question, following the sensation that his brain had brought to his attention, he unleashed a blow using the full force of his body. The backhand blow of steel that was able to shatter rock, striking the wind dead, about to hit what lay ahead of his instincts. Oh, so you can see through my invisibility. Isn't that a bit dangerous? Such a hoarse voice could be heard from beyond his strong fist. Garfield, Car. That instant, his backhand blow should have hit the shadow behind him. Undoubtedly, there was a sensation of something touching the surface of his gauntlet. Nevertheless, a bitter sound escaped his own mouth, and Garfield stared in shock as his thoughts were struck by that impact. The impact had struck him in the back. Someone's small foot or toe was perfectly placed on Garfield's back. An absurd kick, no, that was wrong. That was entirely your own punch. I just let it pass through my body, and returned it to ya. A voice answered his doubt, and every bone in Garfield's body creaked as his eyes widened. Whether it was true or a lie, Garfield's vision was greatly shaken as his internal organs and brain were jolted by the force equivalent to his blow using the full force of his body. Cuts, bruises, broken bones, and ruptured organs could all be healed immediately. Even if he could not fully heal, he could bring it to a point where he could move through sheer force. However, an attack that resonated throughout the core of his body could not be negated. Garfield, HK. At the numbness of his whole body, he gritted his teeth, and Garfield's entire being was on alert for a follow-up attack. He moved his limbs, which were slow to react, and somehow managed to protect the vital points of his neck and head. However, the follow-up he feared did not come. Instead, what was done with the time for that follow-up was containment. Actually, it'd be a pain in the ass if they got past the wall and went inside. With a sigh mixed into his words, the pained cries of 10 people rang out at once. Exhorting his collapsed knees, what filled Garfield's vision as he raised his head was the group of rebels which had accepted his command and were moving to push their way into the imperial capital. Those lined up at the vanguard of their formation had fallen. Centaur people, and beastmen, had their lives taken away in an instant by having black iron flying blades, throwing blades called kunai, punctured into their foreheads and chests. Even if he were to rush in and cast a healing spell, he would not make it in time. It was an attack that caused instant death. As warriors, they must have also had the ability to take on the imperial capital, even if they were not as good as a general like Hafma. If you die, you're a small fry. What does it matter if you're a warrior? Garfield, kaka. Your eyes look like you aren't too pleased, youngster. You're also the one who busted down the rampart, aren't ya? You know, it's real troublin' when dangerous guys keep coming out one after the other, isn't it? The small shadow laughed with an open mouth and ran a finger through his long white eyebrows as he spoke. At last, Garfield kicked off the ground with his foot, and filling his vision as he moved in, was an old man even shorter than Garfield, who himself was considered to be short. However, an old man of small stature was not a very fitting description of this monster. Garfield, damn you. Oh, wait, I'll be your opponent in a bit. There we go. Garfield, huh? Garfield glared at him with hostility, his hair standing on end, but the old man stuck out his arm, his right hand missing from the wrist, to hold him back. Garfield raised an eyebrow at the missing arm, and the old man shook his leg at the same time. A moment later, not knowing what he had done, a horizontal sweeping kick drew a deep line in the earth. It also split the space between Garfield, the old man, and the rebels behind him. And then, the old man turned to the rebels on the other side of the line and told them. Try stepping over that line, target over here. You're all gonna die. Rebels, HK. Question mark, my, it's a relief that you guys are so attentive. I want the young peeps of my village to learn from ya. Lately, they've been disobeying me every time when I say something. I'm the village chief, aren't I? Shrugging his thin shoulders, the old man chuckled, showing his white teeth. It was an attitude of not caring at all about the threat he had made to the rebels just prior to this moment. However, everyone here was made to understand instinctively that the threat was neither a lie nor anything else. Garfield also understood just who the old man in front of him was. Garfield, the vicious old man. Olbart Dunkleken, ain't ya? Olbart, I say this every time someone calls me that, but I really don't like it. It's like slander, isn't it? Garfield, dash. What the fuck do you think you're doing here? Towards the old man, tilting his head towards Olbart, Garfield posed that question. Olbart appeared carefree and natural, which was why Garfield could not let his guard down in the slightest. Olbart stood behind Garfield without any sign of his presence. Right here, in the middle of this plain with good visibility. Garfield, dash. It would still be understandable if he were out of sight, hiding behind a building, and approaching stealthily. Even still, that was more than enough of a threat. In that case, he could be satisfied with the events that took place. However, how could he perceive a being that intruded into this space without a hint of a presence? Though, he was a being that could not be perceived as anything but a threat. Before the trembling Garfield, Olbart raised an eyebrow with his unchanging attitude and let out a ho. Olbart, why am I here, you ask? Isn't that how it always was? Even though it's our job to keep the rebels out, Kafma had the nerve to be a failure, and now I have to clean up his mess. Stating that, the old man pointed out Kafma lying on the ground with his arm missing a hand. Then, with an oops, he retracted his right arm and pointed correctly with his left instead. Olbart, I drew the short end of the stick, seriously. That's why I told him that it would be dangerous if they didn't bring out Chaisha or call back Groovy, but sure enough, he had the nerve to lose. Garfield, sure enough. Old man, you ain't got the fucking right to laugh at this guy. Olbart, ho? Olbart closed one eye and looked displeased. In order to obstruct the old man's gaze, Garfield wedged his way in between Olbart and Kafma, and exhaled a heated breath. Kafma was an enemy. That would not change, but no one was qualified to speak about how Kafma fought except Garfield, who had exchanged fists with him head-on. Garfield, this guy was fucking strong. My amazing self was just stronger. Olbart, dash. Well, yeah, I know that from just looking, yeah? I'm not gonna try it and deny that, you know. So just what are you trying to say, you? Garfield, I'm saying I don't like your damn attitude. Is that how you talk to a fellow general on your own side? Huh? Opening his mouth wide, Garfield snapped back with a howl. At the ferocious roar, Olbart frowned, and tilted his head. Seeming like he was truly doubtful, the old man continued, do you know? Olbart, I'm a general first class, Kafma's a general second class. We're not even remotely the same. Garfield, HK. Unapologetically, Olbart's remarks were just conveying the obvious facts. Garfield's pupils narrowed as he felt an incomprehensible gap. The moment the carnivorous beast determined his prey, he raised his tail and pounced on the old man. He felt like he should pay respect to Kafma. However, he did not feel that for the enemy before his eyes. The old man, too, neither wanted it nor would he give it. Within battle, the things he placed value in differed to his opponent, and recognizing that. Garfield, I'll fucking crush ya. His arms, both raised overhead, closed in on Olbart. With a strong arm that could not measure by feel, he wondered if it was different from when he smashed the ramparts, and it probably exceeded all the might he had used then. He had put enough destructive power into it so that it was more than enough to destroy that small old body. Then, without letting him get away, his arm smashed into Olbart's head. Boom, The impact of the crash shook the earth, and a cloud of dust ascended from the smashed ground as if there had been an explosion. The dust rained down upon the heads of the rebels who had been stopped by Olbart. Perhaps, Olbart would be smashed to pieces after being struck by so much firepower. However, Garfield, Wah. HK. Garfield's eyes widened at the sight before his eyes. Before him, Garfield's fists slammed into Olbart's head from both sides, as if sandwiching him. There was a definite impact and resistance, which Garfield felt through the recoil in his arms. Despite this, the old man, with his head caught between Garfield's fists, showed his white teeth and laughed, and then, "Olbart, incredible, isn't it? I just released the power of your attack onto the ground." Garfield, "Ah." Olbart, "Well, the ground exploded 'cause you've got some dangerous arm strength, though." Immediately after finishing his words, the old man's face, trapped between his fists, slipped out from under. Garfield followed him with his gaze, but Garfield, "You?" As his eyes followed Olbart, who should have slipped below, an impact struck the top of his head. Even though Olbart should have crouched down, something had hit him from above. Olbart, up when you think it's down when you think it's up, that's the basics, the basics. Garfield, "Ah." At the crouched Olbart's flippant words, Garfield furiously swung his fists downwards. They thrust into Olbart's head of grey hair. That moment, a sharp impact pierced the back of Garfield's head, his back, and his buttocks. Garfield's fist, swinging downwards, whiffed, and struck the ground with a tremendous impact. Instead, the voice of Olbart, who disappeared in an instant, was heard from directly above. "Olbart, that's why, if you think I'm below ya, I'll be above. Those who don't learn'll be left behind, you know." Exerting his body, he faced the voice and raised his arms overhead. The moment his fingertips caught hold of something, Garfield swung it down forcefully, trying to smash it into the ground. Smashing it into the ground, preventing its movement, and then struck it with all his might. He thought that if the feet were separated, then acrobatics like the ones before would not be possible. Garfield, The appeal from his fighting instinct ceased when he realized that it was not Olbart within the grasp of his fingers, but Kathma's body that the old man had thrown over Garfield's head. Stopping his movement to throw the body to the ground, Garfield's lips quivered. At that instant, "Olbart, listen here, you, why do you think there are 50 second-class generals and only 9 first-class generals? It's 'cause we're so stupidly strong." The voice and shock bore into Garfield's head from both left and right. As a massive flame descended, that wrath of the sky intended to consume the world in its entirety. It gave Yorna the illusion that the world was being dyed in red before her eyes. If one could greatly rouse its wrath, the world would probably take out all of the anger it had saved up to this point on that single individual. The ground had already been turned to scorched earth, and the rebels and plants were all burned with the same method. That devastating firepower rained down upon them to scorch them down to their entrails the same way the corpses had been. However, facing that, Yorna made not even the slightest movement, and "Yorna, Yang Sword, Priscilla, my, making your daughter use such a terribly rough thing." The sound spun by Yorna's lips was the signal for the treasured sword of deep crimson to swing vertically. It was a beautiful sword that would capture the eyes of those who saw it, burn their hearts, and even captivate their souls. That bewitching nature was only an accessory to the treasured sword, it was not even a sliver of its original purpose. In other words, when it fulfilled its original reason for existing, the brilliance of the treasured sword would become even stronger. Yorna, The Yang sword, the tip of which was swung vertically upward to intercept the tremendous fire that was raining down upon them. That instant, the mighty flames that had permeated their vision disappeared. It was not that they were cut away. Quite literally, they had disappeared as if they had never even existed. "Priscilla, my Yang sword burns what I wish to burn and slashes only what I wish to slash." That logic was far too violent, far too irrational, and far too absurd of an imposition. However, That sight had materialized before her eyes, and the inferno that seemed like it could destroy even the world vanished. Pouring in an appropriate amount of power, she had released that great firepower with the intention to dampen their first move, but at the sight of its erasure with a single swing of a sword, even their opponent was not able to stay calm. Priscilla, do not look down on her, for that is the Spirit Eater. Regardless of whether it was an explanation or a warning, it was impolite, and with those words Priscilla's figure flew to the right. Similar to Priscilla, flying to the opposing left, was Yorna. In between the two of them, a massive flash flood rushed through. Yorna, HK. It was as if the entire contents of a well had been unleashed, and Yorna, while successfully evading, felt that her enemy, that Arakia had heightened her capabilities above her previous impression. This was not the first time Yorna had fought Arakia. They had previously crossed paths just once before, during an uprising considered to be brought about by Yorna. At that time, Wallachier's strongest was looming behind Arakia, and the stage was set in chaos flame, where Yorna herself was in a perfect position to face them, so the preconditions were already variously different. Of course, Yorna was serious about fighting, but her true intentions at the time were not really serious about killing them. During past uprisings, especially the one which resulted in a clash with Arakia, Yorna's goal was retribution against those who had meddled with the residents of the Demon City, and to make known the righteousness of doing so. In other words, her objective was a kind of protest, and Vincent, who faced her across the board, must have been aware of this intention, and it was a clash in which a reconciliation seemed possible. However, Arakia was unaware of those circumstances at that time, and probably did not hold back in her fight against Yorna. Since then, Yorna had assumed that Arakia's strength completely surpassed those of the other troops, and so she was expected to serve as a standalone force comparable to an army. However, that perception was not only incorrect, but also naive. Yorna, so, disregarding Old Man Olbart, is this what it means to be the second? Letting that out together with a long sigh, Yorna glanced behind. Through the pressure of the unleashed water, the land itself had been split vertically all the way until the horizon. She understood the rationale that pressurized water posed a threat. However, when she saw how extraordinary it was, Yorna rolled up the sleeves of her kimono. In preparation for the decisive battle, she had worn her favorite kimono. Even so, she wondered if it would be possible to stop Arakia's blow. Yorna, before, you only used fire, so you had burned one half of my city to the ground, but in one breath, Arakia had burned one half of her city, and today, she also burned the rebels to nothing by the ramparts. Arakia had assumed that a defensive line of fire, which was well suited to stone structures, and a battlefield where one did not need to pay attention to one's surroundings, would be convenient for her, and that she had no reason to change her battle strategy now. Priscilla, this idea was also planted in your head, though it would have been so much more charming if it had not been directed towards mineself. After saying so, Priscilla kicked off the ground, and closed in on Arakia. With one of the bastions of the Star Fortress behind her, as if to protect it, Arakia flew through the air, her legs ablaze below the knees. Even just the unrelenting firepower that rained down from high above was enough of a threat. First, Arakia needed to be lured down to an approachable position. Priscilla, dear mother. Yorna, HK, got it. Priscilla shouted as she rushed through, causing a momentary disturbance within Yorna. She had yet to obtain a proper sense of the intimacy between her and her now reunited daughter. Rather, she was doubtful of Priscilla's pompous attitude toward her mother, who had changed appearance. Since they parted when she was a suckling infant, she had no way of knowing how Priscilla was raised. Yorna, dance. Taking the kisero out of her mouth, Yorna swung the tip of it and struck the ground with her thick-soled shoe. Then, in front of the advancing Priscilla, the trembling earth slowly peeled up and rose to become a foothold to support Priscilla's path. Yorna's soul marriage technique also worked on inorganic objects. However, it was a system in which the strength of its efficacy was proportional to the amount of time and devotion she had put into it. Therefore, she had an apprehension. How much could she really love the land where she had spent time with the man she loved? Though, the results were clear. Priscilla, your work was for a great cause. Leaving her mother with a statement that did not make her feel like a mother, Priscilla hopped to the footholds directly in front of her. Of course, the footholds did not stop there, they emerged one after another to create a path towards Arakia. A single straight path would be targeted, so she continued to take the consideration to create multiple paths. Because of that, Arakia, nuisance. As Arakia swung her arm holding the branch, the great wind that was released completely uprooted the floating earth and mowed down all the paths. Rather than a storm, the great wind was powerful enough to be equivalent to being hit by a giant palm, and the force of it was such that even Priscilla could have been completely crushed by it if it hit her directly. Priscilla, to drive that into mine self so mercilessly, would you not miss mine beauty? Arakia, I've made up my mind. Even if you lose your limbs, princess is still princess. Priscilla, would it not be more accurate to say your mind has been made up for you? Narrowing her eyes, Priscilla hit Arakia with those words as she descended from high in the sky. Just before the great wind mowed down the foothold, Priscilla quickly escaped into the sky. She barely managed to avoid being hit by the wind, a feat of sheer perception, but she was still vulnerable to a second blow. Truly erasing the hesitation from her eyes, Arakia took aim at Priscilla's limbs as she was forced to fall, and raised her arm in a merciless attempt to take away her fighting ability. And then, Yorna, I would be troubled if you forgot about me. Flying up from directly below, Yorna's kick was delivered towards Arakia, who was preoccupied with Priscilla being above her head. Yorna's long legs thrust upward, as her meticulously maintained thick soles, which she treasured greatly over time, followed her decisive blow. Priscilla, it is unbecoming of someone your age to be more eye-catching than mineself. Synchronizing with Yorna's kick, Priscilla swung the yang sword held overhead straight down. Arakia had been caught in a cross-generational pincer attack of mother and daughter. In perfect unison, the two enchanting strikes worthy of self-praise struck each other. Yes, they had struck each other. Priscilla and Yorna, HK? The strike that should have caught Arakia was bereft of a hit reaction. Rather, the expected impact had been slightly off and produced a solid sound instead. From the look of it, the thick sole of Yorna's upwards kick collided with nothing other than the blade of the yang sword Priscilla had swung down. Their pincer attack had missed this crucial opponent and they had rather astoundingly struck each other instead. What was more surprising was that the collision of both Yorna and Priscilla's attacks had been inside Arakia's seemingly flickering body. Yorna, it passed through her? Priscilla, how impudent. Immediately after Yorna's astonishment and Priscilla's irritation spilled over simultaneously, Arakia's body, having seemingly taken in both attacks, glowed white, as a counterattack was unleashed. It was as if Arakia's whole body exploded. No, it had, in fact, exploded. Arakia's body scattered into rays of white light, dispersing with terrifying force spread in every direction like buckshot, hitting Yorna and Priscilla like a fountain of water. Yorna, coup dot. In an instant, Yorna gathered the fine pieces of whirled-up dirt by the previous gale, and clad herself and Priscilla in a cloud of dust. Rather than cladding them in clothing that stuck to the body, it was a delicate technique that circulated around one's figure at high speed to repel attacks. If Arakia's buckshot merely had the firepower one would discern at first glance, this would have sufficiently reduced its power. However, Yorna, HK. Easily penetrating the cloak of earth, Arakia's rays had pierced Yorna and Priscilla. Blown away by the impact, Yorna dropped to the ground while screaming in agony. With all her strength, she instantly burrowed her stretched-out feet in the ground to avoid an unsightly fall. She could not afford to collapse, much less miserably falling on her back. Yorna, to lose the ones in love with me. The weight of the soul Yorna held was sustained by the presence of those that loved her. Therefore, Yorna needed to respond to said love with all her might. To respond to love was not something to be done half-heartedly. She must aspire to be appropriate in her movements, speech, conduct, and even emotions. Whether it was in everyday life, in the bedroom, or in the middle of a battle, it was all the same. With a faint bang, the hairpin that held Yorna's hair in place shattered. Hanging on which were ornaments made of layering scales. Priscilla, was that a gift from someone? Dear mother. Yorna, It was a gift from my beloved children. Shattered, Yorna caught the pieces of dust from the hair ornament with her fingers, and gently gazed upon them. Most of the items that Yorna wore were gifts. Her kimono, footwear, and even her hair ornaments, be they woven, carved or molded, the inhabitants of the demon city had gone to great lengths to craft these beautiful items with their own hands, which became imbued with the souls of their creators. The ones that received Yorna's love received the capability to be crushed on her behalf to protect her in return. Yorna, you too? Priscilla, unfortunately, I do not boast the same fidelity as you, dear mother, merely what I have had on hand from the very beginning, the tribute from my already late husband. Saying this, Priscilla gently displayed her ear. In this motion, it was revealed that the green jeweled earring that should have been there had disappeared. She too had transferred her life force to those she loved, providing her a longer life. Yorna, your husband? Priscilla, you also. Priscilla, what a meek expression to make. These missing earrings, I received them from my fourth husband, I believe. Yorna, fourth. Priscilla, 8 times I was bestowed a husband. Of course, that does not rival you, dear mother. At Priscilla, callously stating this unexpected answer, Yorna's mouth was left agape from the shock. However, this shock was negated by Priscilla's grasp of the radiant yang sword. That strange phenomenon from earlier was. Yorna, Priscilla, if that is the yang sword, then it should be able to reach any opponent. Provided, their soul hasn't been severed by the life sword. Priscilla, even without you telling me, dear mother, I am painstakingly aware of that. However, there is something you are mistaken about. Yorna, mistaken? Priscilla, my yang sword burns what I wish to burn and slashes only what I wish to slash. Saying that, Priscilla slowly raised the tip of her yang sword. What assembled beyond the tip of the yang sword, as Yorna followed it with her gaze, was Arakia, scattered white light forming her figure little by little. Reflecting the nature of the spirit they had devoured, the spirit eaters were said to be able to house the strength they possessed in their bodies, while the true nature of this rare ability was unknown. The capability for its capabilities to be expanded upon was remarkable. Just now, the principle behind transforming light into a body, by thinking it through, it became clear. The yang sword that slashed what it wanted to slash, a treasured sword that could reach all things. Priscilla, is that fire, water, or wind? If that becomes indistinguishable from light or shadow, there is no doubt that it becomes difficult, even if I can still reach you. Arakia, Priscilla's crimson eyes narrowed, meeting the gaze of Arakia whose eyes were the same color. The owner of the yang sword that could reach all things, and the transcendent being, possessing the ability to transform into anything, confronting each other. Yorna, I see, you were raised with quite a troublesome opponent. Had this been Chaos Flame, Yorna may have been able to properly take down Arakia. But, this was not Chaos Flame, and Yorna was hardly at full strength. Therefore, the one to deliver the decisive blow was not Yorna but Priscilla. At any time, it is I who resides at the center of the stage after all. The girl blazing red as the sun, who turned any hardships she faced into sustenance for herself, smiled graciously. That smile was dazzling, even for Yorna who stood alongside her. Set ablaze by Priscilla's dazzle, if there was only a single being capable of remaining in her vicinity without being scorched to naught, for that being to be Arakia, standing in Priscilla's path, what an ironic twist of fate it was. Otto Suwin sensed a change in the direction of the wind. At first it was a hunch, then it changed into an omen to be received, and finally it became a conviction. The war situation that was gradually and slowly changing, moving, and tilting, as Otto opened the channels that were supposed to be kept closed and immersed himself in the task of picking up all kinds of voices, he was fluxing in a sense of omnipotence, as if he himself was at one with the world, and was fleeting. Things that could only be found in such a situation were submerged in an overwhelming vortex of information. In order to retrieve them, one must dive deeper and deeper. Otto-san. Otto, HK, a voice from outside of his consciousness was heard very close by, and at the same time, a thirsting shock destroyed the whirlpool of voices. It was as if a water tank had been broken and the water inside flowed out, as if grains of sand had been scooped up from a sandbox and spilled out through the cracks between one's fingers. The voices escaped. Though he felt empty without it, and finding himself regretful. Otto, oh, my. Thank you for saving my life, Petra-chan. Petra, you had a horrible complexion right now. Please wipe up your nosebleed. Otto, oh, that is a big help. I feel like I am bleeding just as much, though I am not fighting. Otto took the offered handkerchief and squeezed it against his nose. The dripping blood was wetting the grass beneath his feet, and he was acutely aware of the heavy load that using his divine protection beyond its limits was putting on him. In fact, the amount of blood that had been spilled was seemingly no joke to him. As expected, it was not as bad as when his legs were carved in Pristella, though. Otto, it comes quite a bit, if I try to dive far and deep. Petra, am I not being helpful? Otto, no, if it was not for Petra's support, it would probably be worse. The exhaustion of the interior of my head. I guess I should call it brain fatigue. And that is because it is pretty heavy. It was difficult for them to understand each other, even among those who possessed divine protections, but the way in which divine protections placed a burden on their users varied greatly depending on their effects. For example, the divine protection of wind evasion possessed by a ground dragon was almost a perfect type of divine protection with no flaws, except for the drastic difference in its burden between when it was deployed and when it was not. Garfield's divine protection of earth spirits also had a positive effect while he was standing on the ground, but at the same time, it placed a high burden on his body in order to maintain his physical well-being. It just happened that Garfield was physically strong, so he was not affected by the negative effects, but if a normal human were to possess it, they would need to regularly take breaks and relieve the burden on their body by lifting their legs from the ground. From that perspective, Otto's divine protection of the soul of language focused the majority of its burden on his brain. Since the brain converted the voices of living beings that entered through his ears into voices that Otto could understand, it was natural for the burden to be concentrated there. Otto was trying to pick up the voices that were normally kept closed off and grasp all the sounds he could hear. Therefore, he asked for Petra to use her freshly learned yang magic to physically strengthen Otto's body, focusing particularly on his head. For a skilled warrior, it was said that physical strengthening through mana was done naturally, but in this case it was being done through external interference. Of course, even with the functions of one's head being strengthened with yang magic, Emilia's intuition would not suddenly become as sharp as Ram's. The expectation was that Petra's yang magic would improve Otto's endurance, rather than the functions of his brain. By strengthening the capabilities of his brain, Petra would allow Otto to keep the channels open for longer, much like how improving cardiovascular function would allow someone to stay underwater for longer. Without Petra's cooperation, the results would have been less than half of what they were then, without a doubt. Otto, that said, there are many times when I almost get too greedy and try to go deeper. Petra, if I feel like you're in somewhat danger, I can just give you a slap to the best of my power, right? Otto chuckled at Petra, practicing her slap with reassuring readiness. In fact, if Otto was in danger, it was in his best interest to have Petra pull him back. The fastest and surest way to do this was to forcibly disconnect the channel. As he followed the sound of a voice, he would begin to lose track of his own position. Of course, the voice that Otto focused on naturally when he talked to Petra was the correct one, but if he lost sight of that connection, he would probably lose his ability to recognize languages. If the closest voice became unrecognizable, Otto would have to keep the channel open forever in order to communicate with anyone. If this were to happen, It would be easy to see a future in which even the mere sound of the wind or the rustling of clothes would be perceived as a voice and Otto would lose his sanity. Otto, when it becomes so, I too will become a member of the people who have lost their lives because of their divine protection, like many others who had this same divine protection. Though he was lucky enough to be able to overcome his childhood without dying, now he would lose his established self due to his own decision to open the channel. Too many pitfalls in the way of life of a bearer of a divine protection. Though it could be said that the more difficult the path was, the more rewarding it was. Petra, so, what happened? Otto, the first and second bastions are useless. There is no one left that I can listen to. The first was burned to the ground, and the second that is Emilia Summers. Petra, Emilia Nisama. Petra reacted with a complicated face at Otto, who was muttering with a handkerchief on his nose. The first bastion was guarded by Arakia, one of the highest-ranking members of the 9 divine generals. Her power, wielded through her spirit, had burnt the entire field, causing the voices of all living things that Otto could have heard to be completely destroyed. If birds, small animals, or insects had not survived, then even if Otto had opened up his channels, there would have been no voices for him to pick up in the first place. Petra, if the field is burnt, wouldn't the ground beneath the surface be fine? Otto, even if they have survived, underground creatures often do not speak. Besides, as I told Petra-chan, the divine protection of the soul of language is. Petra, it only allows you to understand the speech of audible creatures, it doesn't make your ears better. Otto, that is right. Otto nodded emphatically at Petra's words, who was leaning in front of him. As Petra had just said, Otto's divine protection of the soul of language was only able to understand the voices he heard and allowed him to converse with others who spoke a different language. In other words, the divine protection could not be employed properly unless living beings were in a location where their voices could be heard. Petra's application of her yang magic to strengthen Otto's head also played a role here. By having his hearing and listening abilities enhanced, he was able to pick up voices over a wider range than usual. However, Otto, there is no chance for the first and second bastions anymore. They were burnt by Arakia and frozen by Emilia Summer, respectively. Petra, Emilia Nisama isn't as malicious as to do that. Otto, I know. And even if Emilia Summer had not done anything, the reaction from the others at the second bastion was already quite negative. Probably because the other creatures were afraid of the dragonkin. Petra's way of saying that malice did not exist in Emilia, rather than Emilia having no malicious intent, had been a perfectly fitting way for Petra to put it. Since there was no malice present in Emilia, there was no way to display any. Regardless, with such shared views aside, Petra's advocacy was also deceptively true. The guardian of the second bastion was Madeline Eschart, the dragonkin who had almost plunged the fortress city into a state of total destruction, and was part of a demi-human race so exceedingly rare, people questioned its very existence. Since the dragonkin were related to the dragons, which reigned at the pinnacle of all existence, they were feared by animals, no matter how large or small, leaving them no choice but to flee. Emilia lowering the temperatures in the area to extremely cold degrees conveyed the impression of a last-ditch effort. Anyway, Otto, as for the fifth bastion, Garfield should handle it well. The fourth bastion is under constant attack by a group of Glow people. As instructed, the Weaponkin and Cyclops tribe survivors will join them there. Petra, and at the third, the Shadrakian people joined the other groups fighting the stone golems. What about the other way around the bastions you wanted to explore? Otto, it looks like there is a direct path from the first bastion to the castle that had been filled up ahead of time somehow. I am unexpectedly getting sick of Abel-san guessing correctly. Petra, but since someone doesn't have to go and check it out, we can make the next move faster. After bringing the mental image of the voice distribution in order, he compared it with the map Petra spread out in front of him. Otto added the information he had just obtained to the map, which already had a number of characters drawn on it, and Petra assigned arrows and other markers to it. With brain fatigue and even a strange feeling of heaviness, As if warm water was accumulating within his head, Petra's presence was critical in pulling together these visually unshareable images. For the Emilia camp, Petra's inclusion might have been the most significant. At the very least, Otto took it as Subaru's greatest achievement that Petra was here now. Otto, since Natsuki-san is the reason we are doing this, it balances out to 0, but... With a deep, bloody breath forced out of his nose, Otto checked to see if his nasal passages were still open. Petra's handkerchief was already stained with Otto's blood. Assuming he would buy a new handkerchief later and give it to her, Otto slowly got to the point of switching to a different channel. There was. Otto-chin. Petra-chan. Otto, medium-chan. A small figure ran to them in the meadow, waving her hands in a wide arc. Her long blonde hair danced in the air as she ran restless across the battlefield. She ran in a straight line to Otto and Petra. Medium, you've been very helpful, Otto-chin. Abel-chin wants the next report. Otto, I am absolutely sure that you did not mean to say that in a cute way, however, I appreciate it. If it helps you, there is nothing to be gained by giving something to someone who does not understand its value. Petra, why so sharp-tongued, Otto-san? Although it is understandable. Otto and Petra smiled slightly at Medium's report, who had a twinkle in her eye. Unintentionally, Medium had been acting as a soft intermediary in the chain of command. Focusing on gathering information was reassuring for Otto since he could easily leave the management of that information to Abel and his group. This was another scheme that would not have been possible without Medium. Medium, it might have been doable, but also more awkward, for sure. Otto, probably. Especially since Petra-cha. Lady Petra and I are the ones who have to take a hard stand against Abel-san. Medium, Am I getting praised? Hooray! Otto and Petra's exchange was met with great delight by Medium, who raised both hands in the air. Slightly behind her were 4 soldiers who were sent to Otto and Petra to make contact with the main camp. This was probably a result of the importance Abel attached to the value of the information Otto brought. Normally, it would be easier for Abel if Otto were also in the main camp. Medium, Otto-chin, you have to wander around to hear the voices, right? Petra, it's because Otto-san's ears are not that big, you know. Otto, both are different ways of saying the same thing. In contrast to Medium's ingenuous remark, Petra responded with banter, yet both were tricky in their own regard. Although, it was generally true, so there was no denying it. At any rate, they handed over the map they had just drawn to the messengers and received a new map in return that reflected the ongoing changes in the state of the battle. Otto, please use this well. There are a few typographical errors, but the arrows and other symbols that the lady added should be understandable. Messenger, understood. Be cautious for scouts, Analyst Dono. Otto, Analyst. Otto looked bitter at the title given to him. Along with the map they exchanged, first a peddler, then an internal affairs minister, then a warrior-grade head internal affairs minister, and now an analyst. How many positions would he have to hold before the royal selection was concluded? Or would these troubles continue to haunt him even after the royal selection was concluded? Otto, I guess I should put such blissful worries off to the side. At the very least, the tomorrow Otto envisioned would not come to pass unless he completed what was in front of him. Tomorrow was something Otto had no choice but to face on his own. That was why? Petra, Otto-san, let's move. Otto, dear me, how about a minute's rest, my lady? Petra, says the person who usually doesn't rest even when someone tells him to. You can drink until you pass out when everything is done, so try to do your best. Otto, that makes me sound like the biggest drunkard in the world. When Otto raised his voice about the reputational repercussions, Petra stuck out her tongue to gloss over it. In such a way, he was feeling cared for without becoming too serious. Otto slapped himself on the cheek free from blood stains to regain his focus. He was not sure whether he wanted to ask Petra or Garfield how frightened he looked or if he could even afford it. All of those things were normally the responsibility of Subaru, who was not there. Otto, I might as well get the victory benefits. That is why. Immediately after, Otto opened up the channel to gather more information. A loud noise shook Otto's mind. Otto, Petra, Otto-san? Seeing Otto's stiffened face, Petra called his name. However, Petra's voice did not reach Otto's ears. It was because they were covered with deafening screams filling up the world. Otto, In an instant, Otto's mind felt like it was boiling over, and he held his head in shock. However, just before his consciousness was blown away, Otto managed to just barely hold out. Terrible screams still engulfed the world. The reason was Otto, As Otto was struck by the sudden shock, the two girls, Petra and Medium, looked at the sky and dropped their jaws. Before the sight of those girls, as it fell straight from the sky to the ground, majestically spreading its wings just before it crashed, was a presence that, even from a distance, conveyed a palpable sense of why the world screamed. It was no wonder why every living thing in the world screamed. A dragon. It was not clear whether it was Petra, Medium, or one of the messenger soldiers who said this. Otto could say for certain that it wasn't himself. Why was it that Otto, At the moment when everyone on the battlefield was captivated by the white dragon that had appeared, there were only two people whose consciousness were not stolen by its presence. One of them, pulled Petra with one hand, while pushing Medium's shoulder with the other. Petra, Kya. Petra let out a scream and collapsed onto Otto's chest, who had fallen backwards forcefully. In the lower part of his vision, the pushed-back Medium had fallen onto her rear. Those were the minimum evasive actions Otto could do at that moment. A mass of red-hot flames scorched the air as it passed over the heads of the grounded Otto and Petra, as well as Medium sitting on her butt. Petra, After being pulled down, Petra's slender throat let out a scream. But being able to scream was a kind of safety signal. If the situation had been more horrendous than that, there would not even have been time to scream. In fact, just like the messenger soldiers who were out of Otto's reach. Otto, A mass of flame flew over the heads of Otto and the girls, while hitting the messenger soldier holding the map. In the next moment, the entire body of that soldier clad in a red and black military uniform was instantly burnt to a crisp. Due to the map in hand, there was no chance to prevent it. And, upon catching sight of such devastation, they were not even permitted to raise their voices in astonishment. Watch out! Immediately after the girl's high-pitched scream came the sound of steel striking steel echoing through the air. The one who spoke up was Medium despite being pushed by Otto. She straightened her long childlike legs from her sitting position and pulled out a barbarian sword from behind her waist in a low posture. Yet, she still managed to bounce back the deadly blade descending upon Otto with all her might. Petra, stand up, Otto-san. Otto stumbled forward as Petra pulled him up by the arm. When he stepped back and looked behind him, he saw Medium, with both of her hands gripping a barbaric sword too large for her petite frame, as she stared down the assailant head-on. Then, my bad, and here I was going to get them all at once. Saying that, the grumbling man who faced Medium was the only one apart from Otto who consciously ignored the presence of the white dragon creating this abnormal situation on the battlefield. It was an imperial soldier with a bandana wrapped around his head. He held a long-handled one-handed axe, and judging from his armband, he was not a high-ranking opponent. A common soldier. The question was, why was that man here? While his channel was focused, he had remained vigilant. So how had this man managed to avoid Otto's monitoring of voices? With the utmost caution possible, Otto protected Petra behind him with his arm and glared at the man facing Medium. Otto, no mercy for women and children? That's pretty barbaric, don't you think? Todd, it's easy to just answer there are no women or children in the battlefield, but then the residents of the imperial capital would get caught up in this. Besides, ain't that a bit too convenient? Otto, convenient? Todd, if you were a non-combatant who was just left behind on the battlefield, your current logic might hold. But I don't recognize a man who serves on the battlefield as a non-combatant. He was the type of person who would mercilessly ambush with full intent to kill them. It was unlikely that a reasonable negotiation would have worked from the beginning, but in the face of his thoroughness, it could be said that hope was completely dashed. But still, it did not make sense. Otto, me and these kids are here for work? And what kind of work, so far away from the camp? Todd, who knows? But my gut is telling me. You are the root of all evil in this war. And my gut also tells me this. Otto, such as? The man who looked at Otto and the others in a nonchalant, dismissive manner cut off his words there at once. When Otto urged him onward, the man looked at the three of them in turn and Todd, it's better not to waste time with you guys either. His axe swung with that pronouncement, gleaming as it mercilessly aimed to take the lives of Otto, Petra, and Medium. Arc 7, Chapter 96, Painting with Deep Love. One of the 9 divine generals, the Steelman, Moguro Hagane. That fact that they were not truly a steelfolk was known to only a select few even within the Wallachian Empire. Originally, the bodies of the steelfolk were composed of inorganic substances like minerals and metals, and they were born as beings in the space between people and objects. It was conceivable that the weaponkin, whose bodies possessed one part made out of metal, were a race that branched out from the steelfolk, and there were many parts of their abnormal ecology that were obscure. Although they were not as rare as the dragonkin, the steelfolk were distinguished from human tribes not only in appearance, but also in mentality, so in the sense that they were more difficult to communicate with, they overwhelmed the dragonkin. Existence is more difficult to make contact with than spirits, which could be conversed with if one had certain training. Those were the steelfolk. Henceforth, climbing to the top of the empire at the seat of a general first class, and also being said to be easier to contact than the other problem-riddled divine generals, Moguro was recognized as a heretic from within the steelfolk. However, that was not the case in reality, and Moguro took advantage of their own outward appearance, as well as the special trait of lacking involvement with others from the steelfolk tribe, and was in existence who merely self-proclaimed themselves as the Steelman. So then, regarding the true identity of Moguro Hagane, Abel considered this as an absolute truth. It was certain that within this decisive battle to capture the imperial capital, Moguro would be the greatest obstacle. Launched up by an impact that seized his whole body, he met eyes with an excessively mighty being. Immediately after, he received another blow. He could not avoid the future of his life being scattered, and he was convinced that he had finally reached the final destination of his fate. That was what should have happened. Cough, HK. His lungs, deflated to the utmost limits, expanded, and that pain reawakened Heinkel's consciousness. His interrupted consciousness returned, and the first thing he felt was the firm and large sensation of his back being supported. It was the ground. Launched up to the sky, his body which should have been flying through the sky was on top of the ground. Recognizing that fact, bewilderment occupied the insides of his head. For what reason? How? What had happened? Only, at the same time as his brain had comprehended that he was still alive. Heinkel, my sword is. In the empty hand of his body, besieged with pain, there was no feeling of a sword's hilt. Even when his other hand immediately reached out to his waist, there was no weight in the scabbard that hung there. Turning his head, within his vision that was being vigorously shaken along with his brain by the loud ringing in his ears, in a place some ways away from him, Heinkel saw his sword thrust into the earth at a slant, and leaped out a breath. That it had vanished, or it had been lost, he felt his entire body bouncing around as if his heart had become those unthinkable feelings of unease. Heinkel, fuck. Since he had gone through all those things, he began to hate himself for worrying over losing the sword. The fluctuation of his heart in that moment seemed like a representation of his half-assed self. Heinkel, just what? As the causes for him to hate himself increased, Heinkel broke away from his loathsome sentimentality. He was not dead. He still lived. However, that in itself was a strange thing. At that moment, Heinkel had met eyes with an existence which introduced itself as a divine general, and a definite intent to kill had been directed towards him. It had clearly declared that it would kill him. In truth, having been launched up to the sky, then from there, being scattered by another attack with nothing he could do, Heinkel's life should have been lost. For what reason had that not come to fruition? Seeking that answer, he looked around. Heinkel, ah? Unconsciously, an astonished voice slipped out. However, that was a matter of course. What Heinkel saw was absurd enough to warrant that. It was far, far too detached from reality. The world itself was divided in two from where Heinkel was, and separate hells were unfolding. On the right sky, the massive clouds formed from the bright red flames engulfed the scorching world. On the left sky, the majestic figure of a colossal scale, clad in clouds of pure white, spread its wings as it lorded over the frozen lands. Heinkel, a burning sky, and a white dragon. Gazing at the sight which should not have been there, Heinkel muttered in blank amazement. It was possible that he had been mistaken when he felt he had not died. This sight made it seem like Heinkel was already dead, and that was why he was seeing this kind of world. Heinkel, HK. At the world which went beyond what he could take in, thoughts of wishing to escape reality threw him into disorder. That which had done so to Heinkel, causing his whole body to straighten up after lying down on the ground, was the black shadow which suddenly came over him. No way, he did not want to think that there was a second dragon passing right above him, but... Heinkel, woah! Looking up to the sky, Heinkel's throat screamed as he saw the origin of the shadow, passing over him with a tremendous force, flying through the sky as it spun, was an enormous boulder that could be mistaken for a house. Even then, it was not just one or two. One after another, the throwing stones of an abnormal scale passed over his head, clad in an extremely strong wind. They flew from above Heinkel's head towards where his feet were pointed. And then, at the end of where they were headed, Heinkel, The impact of the crash quaked the world, and it shook Heinkel's buttocks, giving him the impression that the ground was coughing violently. As those were continuously fired out, reverberating upon their crash, Heinkel got up from that place in a panic. The one who was continuously being targeted by those boulders, suffering direct hits one after the other, was the figure who was also on an abnormal scale, standing up. It was the rampart itself. Heinkel, Moguro Hagane. That was one of the 9 most feared people within this empire, and from what he could see, Heinkel felt that with his whole body and soul. What he saw just before his consciousness was blown away, he thought that it might have been an optical illusion, or a hallucination he saw when paralyzed by fear, but it had been neither. With a large body that probably exceeded tens of meters, quite literally as the third bastion that Heinkel and the others originally were supposed to capture, Moguro blocked their way. Literally, yes, quite literally. Perhaps this very situation was an existence in this world most suitable for the word literally. In that place, the rampart had gotten up on its knees and taken the shape of a golem, and using the pavements from the upheaved farmland as its own arms and torso, it carried out an unbelievable defensive measure. Swarming at the feet of that massive body were the stone golems, which Heinkel had cut down when he had gotten desperate, and the giant fist struck downwards from above their heads was just like a town crashing down. Heinkel, Aiming for that massive body, were the large boulders which had been fired countless times just a bit before. Those were from both the stone pits along the way to the site of the decisive battle, the imperial capital, as well as the rocks prepared from the crumbled cliffs of the steep mountains to be used in the siege. So then, continuing to throw those towards the large Moguro, were those who were awaiting an opportunity to attack from back at the stronghold. Heinkel, the subordinates of Yorna Mishigya. To be precise, they were the citizens of the demon city of Chaos Flame who Yorna directed. Races with horns and lizardmen, beastmen and those from the multi-legged tribe, they were a mixed force without a sense of unity, and there was only one thing in common which tied them together into an assembled formation. Each one of them housed a red flame in one of their eyes, and housed within was their high morale, that could be said to be what they had in common. This was also quite literally a group whose fighting spirit burned within their eyes, and several of them were able to lift up the unbelievably big boulders, and were able to throw them across an outrageous distance. However, even if one said that Moguro suffered a direct hit from those large boulders, Heinkel's judgment was somewhat doubtful. Of course, through the direct hits of those large boulders, Moguro's construction of the rampart and farmland crumbled, and was broken. However, in order to repair those broken parts, Moguro made the boulders crashing against him into the next materials which formed its massive body, and was certainly offsetting the attacks. Even when looking from afar, the meaninglessness of those attacks was deeply communicated. Even so, the reason why they still did not cease to throw them was plain and simple. While their attacks were keeping Moguro's large body at bay, the other rebels were fiercely attacking. Heinkel, foolish. Heinkel had also heard it. That this third bastion had the weakest defense compared to the other bastions. However, that would have been before Moguro had erected like that, and began to use its entire massive body to block their way. Despite that, the strategy had not been updated, and the rebels who had chosen to withdraw from the other battlefields were converging, and even now they continued to swell up their military strength here. In the midst of that, the people of Shudrak, who Heinkel had fought alongside with, were also present. Heinkel, foolish. Heinkel's deep feelings had leaked out with a sound more clear than before. Foolish. It could not be called anything but foolish. What else was there to say? Looking right or looking left, looking up or looking down, looking forward or looking back, there was nothing to see but hell. Just what else could Heinkel have possibly said? Heinkel, you're all out of your fucking minds. You guys. Everyone. What the hell is wrong with all of you? Before he realized it, Heinkel had jumped towards his sword, thrust into the ground, in order to cling onto it. Putting his weight onto the hilt of the sword thrust into the ground, he grit his teeth as he exhorted his trembling knees. What was wrong with everybody? He was unable to understand their mentality. Like he thought, he could not do it. He could not do it, he could not do it, he could not do it, there was nothing he could do. Heinkel, what the hell is wrong with all of you? While powerlessly leaning against his sword, Heinkel's throat feebly trembled. In the surroundings of Heinkel, who had limply lowered his head, the world was shaken by the flames, by the dragon, and by the huge army. Was it really such a sin for him to not fight against all that? In that case, Heinkel, It was directly after Heinkel had let that leak out. The sound of nimble hooves resounded, and the chestnut-colored Galewind horse passed by Heinkel's side as it stomped on the ground. As his red hair swayed in the wind produced by that Galewind horse, Heinkel looked up. And then, Heinkel, .. For but a moment, Heinkel exchanged gazes with the man with the spherical hairstyle, who sat atop the Galewind horse. It was Zika Osman. Working as the right-hand man of Abel, giving orders to the rebels from the stronghold, while he was also a general of the Wallachian Empire, he was a part of the rebellion against the country. He himself had declared that his fighting skill with his sword was poor, and from Heinkel's point of view, his individual war potential was really difficult to count, but he had overtaken Heinkel. The moment Zika passed him, he left a scornful gaze upon Heinkel, who had bent his knees here. Heinkel, I really? Going past Heinkel, who had bent his knees, the Galewind horse ran towards the battlefield. As if to follow the majestic figure of Zika, the rebels who had gathered from various warfronts headed forwards. Towards Moguro Hagane's rampart, they charged forth. As he watched them, Heinkel still continued to lean on his sword, unable to move. And as he was unable to move, Heinkel, it's just like I thought, I really can't do it, Laoana. When he overtook the red-haired swordsman, who bent his knee on the battlefield and hung his head as if his fighting spirit was disheartened, what flashed through the mind of Zika Osman was sympathy for following the natural course of life. The brave woman of Crimson who introduced herself as Priscilla Bariel had boldly taken part in this rebellion. The swordsman, participating in the war as her follower, was probably not even a person of the Wallachian Empire. It was far too cruel to impose the Empire's way of being that the people of the Empire must be strong on a guy like him. Zika, I can hardly say that I myself follow that way of being. Sword in hand, Zika self-deprecated as he shook atop the back of his beloved horse, Lady. He was currently feigning bravery like this, but it had been largely due to the power that the previous generations of House Osman had accumulated that Zika had taken up the seat of general. If Zika was not part of a lineage of military men, and he had to work his way from the ranks of private like the other soldiers, then he, without any skill in the sword, would probably not have been able to find any success in life. It was not that he lamented that. Of course, Zika was a man of the Empire. Due to that, he swung his sword on the front lines, and the first time he swung it, his heart yearned for him to exist in a way reminiscent of the 9 divine generals, who would be able to alter the war situation. However, to make sure that nobody would be able to take up Zika's position, Zika was once again unable to feign reality by turning that yearning into his personal matter. Therefore, Zika, I am a second-class general of the Empire, the coward, Zika Osman. Raising his voice to a loud volume, his beloved horse galloped across the battlefield where a tremendous change had been accomplished. In most cases, Lady was used to light sprints for the purposes of both strolls and military campaigns. However, this time she could guess what Zika was feeling, so she displayed the best sprint of her life. At seeing his beloved horse put on a brave sprint, completely irrelevant from her fear and anxiety, Zika could only fall in love again. Lady's excessively beautiful sprint ignored Zika's unaccustomed war speech, and sparked a flame in the hearts of many rebels as she continued to dash. Zika, glow people on the right wing. Weaponkin on the left wing. Everyone, move in accordance with the orders. Everyone else, follow me. We shall defeat the Steelman, Moguro Hagane. Everyone, yeah. Hearing Zika's orders, the assembled military strength roared as they charged towards Moguro. The boulders which flew overhead were thrown by the volunteer soldiers who Yorna loved dearly, as a means of providing cover. If those drew Moguro's attention, and a disturbance was yielded in the command of the stone golems, and above all else, if the charge of Zika and the others reached its feet, their aim would be successfully accomplished. Fire. A valiant shout could be heard in the distance, and the fired arrows rained down on the stone golems blocking the way, sowing them to the ground. Commencing from far away, having opened up a distance on Zika's orders, was the overwhelming display of offensive ability by means of the people of Shudrak's archery, and the archery of the rebels skilled in the bow. He accepted the cover from the beautiful and high-spirited women, and pushed forward. Including the battle formation that those women had reasonably lowered, it seemed too good to be true, so Zika clenched his molars. Zika, no, if anything is too good to be true, it would be that blessing. Gripping his sword tight, looking towards its drawn blade, Zika slightly loosened the corners of his lips. Right before he departed for battle, the one to bestow Zika with a blessing as he visited the camp enclosure, was the sweet girl whose eyes somewhat inspired a sense of reverence, just as if it was a gaze that had lived an amount of time unimaginable to Zika. It graciously met his entreaty. It was not that the coward had been blown away. Only, thinking about the duty he must accomplish himself, Zika wished for a blessing. Even if there was only a slight chance, he had wanted to rely on his superstitions. General Second Class Zika. Please fall back. We can handle things here. Zika, do not speak nonsense. There is no path of retreat. Nor is there room to fall back. I shall also move forward. HK, straddling his gale-wind horse, he shook his head at the appeal of the soldier riding next to him. Zika would not abandon his duty. For a moment, the subordinate attempted to say something, but he did not get in the way of Zika's determination any further. Grateful for that consideration, he tightly gripped the reins. To think that General Second Class Zika Osman, the womanizer, would proceed to the front lines. Then, opposite of the subordinate riding next to him, a figure sprinting at the same speed as a gale-wind horse caught up to them. Looking at him, he was wearing an eye patch, a soldier wielding twin swords, Jamal or Ali. He became a prisoner of war during the fall of the fortress city, and after that, since he displayed strong loyalty towards His Excellency the Emperor Vincent Wallachia, he was taken under the command of Zika as a swordsman. Zika, Private First Class Jamal, how is their response? Jamal, the fucking best. Whether I look left or right or directly in front, there's a fuck ton of enemies. I'm having an absolute blast. Zika, it is indeed quite magnificent. It is the honor of an imperial soldier. From here, I intend on removing General First Class Moguro from the seat of 8th, so will you follow me? Jamal, only if you order me. If you want, I can head over there and open up the path. An uncouth yet charming smile emerged on his face, and Jamal accelerated after saying that. He easily overtook Lady's speed, and charged right into the group of stone golems directly in front of them. While chasing after his back, on the other side of Zika thinking his bravery was reliable, he felt guilty for taking him along. However, he immediately discarded that hesitation. He would fulfill what he needed to do in the place that he needed to do it. That had been requested of him, so it was none other than Zika himself who desired to meet those requests. What remained was, Zika, Your Excellency, you are free to do as you wish. Indeed, it had been practically at the same time as when Zika offered up a prayer. The crystal palace of the imperial capital Lupagana, the magic crystals upon its summit began to glow. In this decisive battle for the imperial capital, there were several people painting over the picture Abel had painted. One of them was the existence of Priscilla, who joined the battle of the first bastion which Yorna Mishigia faced. One of them was Otto, who through use of his divine protection, demonstrated his ability to gather information on the details of the war situation. One of them was Garfield, who instead of being in a deadlock with Kafma Irelux, was able to crush him. One of them was Emilia, who angered Madeline Ischat more than had been assumed, and caused her to invoke the Cloud Dragon. And yet, even if that added some change in the coloration of the picture Abel had painted, they were not incidents that greatly changed its final form. If one of the 5 bastions on the points of the star-shaped ramparts that defended the imperial capital were to be broken through, then there were means to seize victory even if the other bastions were locked in stalemate. For those who painted over the picture, the main reason why it could not be swayed, no matter what they did, was Moguro Hagane. No, it was the meteor which governed the Crystal Palace, the heart of the Wallachian Empire. The Crystal Palace, which boasted beauty of preeminent status within the world, the magic crystals that formed the crystal portion of the palace were especially pure even among magic stones, and it made the palace itself into a weapon to attack outside enemies. The mana stored within the palace could be passed through the magic crystals located everywhere in the building to amplify it, and then be released through the magic crystal cannon installed on the highest layer of the Crystal Palace. That power was able to bring about enough destruction to wipe out the entirety of a large city, and in the past, when it had been used hundreds of years prior, legends say that its target had been a great disaster. Henceforth, the magic crystal cannon of the Crystal Palace remained only a thing of legends, but since the existence of the real thing had been known, it had been serviced to be made possible to use, so the threat was restored. As irony would have it, that magic crystal cannon had become a fang pointed towards Abel himself, but as long as it was present, there was a high probability that the war situation of the decisive battle of the imperial capital could be easily overturned. Therefore, no matter what, there was a need for this magic crystal cannon to be fired. That, too, was not a decisive blow in order to change the war situation, but part of the damages taken into his consideration. For that purpose, Abel, will you desert and run away, Zika Osman? That was what Abel had asked Zika, who mounted his Galewind horse, and headed towards the battlefield of the third bastion. Zika had a choice. Managing the rebels who had chosen to move away from the battles of the other bastions, and converge on the third bastion, raising their morale, facing the massive body of Moguro, who blocked the way. He had the choice to desert that warfront. However, Abel had a hunch that he would likely not choose that. Was it because of Zika's prudence as the coward, who feared even the slightest possibility that his goal would not be fulfilled, or was it perhaps because he was one of the brave and righteous members of the imperial army? Whichever it was, Abel, who was not Zika, could not surmise. However, whatever the reason for his determination may be, Abel would not discourage it. The life or death of Zika was a position which held no final impact on the picture that Abel had painted. Speaking on the grand scale of things, ultimately, within his picture, even the life or death of Abel himself. Reporting from the lookout. The magic crystal cannon of the Crystal Palace is beginning to operate. Abel, its target, the third bastion. The resoundment of the bellowing voice throughout the stronghold was proof of Abel's aim being fulfilled. The magic crystal cannon was fired upon it. Upon the third bastion, that is to say, mowing down the battlefield of Mogoro, who had turned into the rampart itself, it would likely wipe out the rebels in one fell swoop. Even if that happened, as long as Mogoro's true body of the Crystal Palace was going strong, then neither would the steelman, Mogoro Hagane, be defeated, nor would the third bastion be overcome. However, the imperial capital would forfeit the firepower of the magic crystal cannon, which had the ability to overturn any war situation. Everything was for that purpose, after all, it had been painted on that illustration. Therefore, there is something unusual in the line of fire of the magic crystal cannon. Abel, what? Upon the moment his plan had succeeded, that report was an incident completely outside Abel's hypothesis. In this decisive battle for the imperial capital, there were several people painting over the picture Abel had painted. One of them was the existence of Priscilla, who joined the battle of the first bastion which Yorna Mishigia faced. One of them was Otto, who through use of his divine protection, demonstrated his ability to gather information on the details of the war situation. One of them was Garfield, who instead of being in a deadlock with Kafma Irelux, was able to crush him. One of them was Emilia, who angered Madeline Ischat more than had been assumed, and caused her to invoke the Cloud Dragon. And then? Impossible. In the distance, beyond the hulking, writhing city walls of Mogoro Hagane, lay the Crystal Palace, the very heart of the beloved imperial capital and the symbol of the Walachian Empire's authority. At the top of that beautiful palace, only a few people even knew of that weapon, and in fact, even the general did not know of the existence of the magic crystal cannon until he had heard about it from Abel. Zika Osman risked his life to make them misfire that single, precious shot of this decisive weapon that, if fired, would cleave the horizon and completely disrupt the tide of battle. Riding his beloved horse across the front lines, he appealed loudly that they had the chance to win the battle, and while rallying up the rebels, he appealed for their support in order to get the magic crystal cannon to focus on them, all this in order to mislead them into believing that this was the best opportunity to make a decisive change in the battle. Hence, the moment the pinnacle of the Crystal Palace glowed, Zika was convinced that he had accomplished the task. His mind was filled with images of his mother, of his elder sisters, and of his younger sisters, those women so crucial to the formation of his own self, and he even smiled at how much like him that was. A prayer far too beautiful to let die in one's embrace, a demise that was supposed to come peacefully, but was replaced with astonishment before the wide-eyed Zika. Because of Zika, Miss Beatrice? Beatrice figured this is what it would be, in fact. Beatrice muttered to herself while in free fall, her dress and long curly hair fluttering in the air. When confronted by Zika, who had come to Beatrice and the others' camp tent to ask for her blessing as a warrior, Beatrice had a gut feeling that he intended to die. 400 years ago, in that time of constant warfare, there were many with the same look in their eyes. Back then, Beatrice was not able to reach out to them. Some did not want to be reached out to, and some did not know how to reach out. Perhaps even if Beatrice were to repeat that time again, it would be hard to imagine that she could have approached it better. Surely she would experience the same helplessness again, watching them go to their deaths. But that is Beatrice, no reason to do the same here today, I suppose. AAU. With their characteristic pattern, Beatrice's eyes faced forward, and there was a little girl holding Beatrice's thin shoulders from behind as if she were holding her tightly. Beatrice did not forgive the little girl with golden hair and blue eyes. It was true that her actions, unknown to her, had made many people miserable. But still, for this one moment, she thought. For this one moment, she believed in some other feeling other than the naivete of Natsuki Subaru. Beatrice and the little girl, Louis, were high up in the sky, even higher than the city walls. After a series of short-range teleports, as if with no other means, Louis brought Beatrice to this place as if to prove her worthiness. Just now, Louis demonstrated her worth. In which case, Beatrice was next to respond to those deeds. Beatrice, Betty can just see everyone's angry faces, in fact. Angry, or perhaps concerned, but in the end, still angry. Beatrice's lips suddenly relaxed as the loving faces of her companions came to her. But there was no choice not to do it. Because Beatrice was. Beatrice, Betty is Subaru's partner, I suppose. At the moment she muttered those words, the entirety of the beautiful palace, visible from a distance, glowed with a dazzling light so bright that it was able to transform the shape of the world, aiming at the rebels who were pushing forward on the ground in a straight line. Zika and his men, who were leading the charge, would be engulfed by the shot that would be far too destructive for them. Interrupting the line of fire with Louis, Beatrice clasped her hands together in front of her chest. And then. Beatrice, al-Shamak. Then, the hole into another world that swallowed even the light that would change the world, opened then closed. How many were there that could have properly grasped the events of that instant? In truth, if things had come to pass as Abel had painted them, the damage would have been enormous, even if it had been within the range of what had been expected, the impact it would have provoked on those fighting at the other bastions would be immeasurable. However, the magic crystal cannon did not deliver the damage it was intended to unleash, and Zika Osman, having been ready to sacrifice himself, continued on with that same vigor and began to fight the horde of stone golems. The descent of the cloud dragon Mazoya and Emilia's battle with Madeline who had brought it along continued, and the aged skill of the vicious old man Olbart was cornering Garfield. Yorna, the flamboyant, and Priscilla, a mother and daughter, were forced into a fierce battle by the spirit eater Arakia, who had decided to shake off everything to achieve her own ends. Otto and Petra, who had planned to establish control of the battlefield and, in fact, accomplished it partly, confronted the malice along with Medium. There was no significant impact on the state of those battles. Merely, the possibility that the state of those battles would substantially lean unfavorably was now lost. In exchange for this tremendous achievement, Louis, Yue, Ahu, all. The presence of the little girl in Louis's arms faded as she fluttered through the air in a tight embrace. It was, quite literally, the sight of the little girl's figure gradually fading away. As if to deny it, Louis embraced the girl, Beatrice, but it served no purpose. As if scattering into the air, Beatrice's body was about to turn into light. Louis, Screaming, Louis tried hard to deny the situation before her eyes, but no amount of lamenting and screaming could stop the crumbling of Beatrice's existence. In order to save the lives of many, she blew into the beyond the light of destruction that was released. As compensation for that overwhelming power, Beatrice's existence had become disperse. Even if one reached out their fingers to the light waning from as if it were being peeled off, those fingers would not be blocked, instead passing through. Louis, With tears welling up in her ragged, wide blue eyes, Louis screamed. Screaming, even though screaming did not help, she screamed desperately. There was nothing else she could do, and she could not find anything more she could do, so she screamed. And so she frantically screamed and ranted and raved. Louis, With a plop, her large tears scattered freely into the air, and then Louis turned her face away from her face, and out into the distance. Embracing Beatrice in her arms, she looked not at the little girl about to disappear, not at the sky that had turned white, not at the sky that had turned red, Not at the ground where many people were shouting in anger, but at this moment, forgetting everything that formed the battlefield, she looked out into the distance, and then, she leapt toward that distance. Louis, midair, the distance that she could leap at a time was about 10 meters, using it over and over again in a sequence placed a strain on her organs, like they were being squeezed, but she did not care. Taking on all of the burdens that would be placed on Beatrice, Louis leapt. She leapt, 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 and then finally. Louis, dash. Upon reaching the ground, Louis fell forward as if crouching. Ignoring the general lethargy of her body, Louis held up the incredibly light little girl in her arms in front of her. Beatrice, whose very presence was becoming thinner and thinner, was put in front of her. And then. Louis, wow. ? I know. The two of you, you're both being too reckless. Then, suddenly, there was a sigh that sounded like a bitter laugh, and the little girl was snatched away from her outstretched arms. No, she was not taken from her. She was gently held up, then, Beatrice's body was embraced in front of the kneeling Louis's eyes. It was there, in the arms of the black-haired boy who was there, that he gently, cherishingly, tightly held her. Receiving this embrace, visibly so full of love, the girl who had accomplished a great task, her eyelids framed by long eyelashes trembled, and her eyes slowly opened. Then her eyes, with their distinctive pattern, flickered. Beatrice, you left me so worried, in fact. ? Yeah, I love you too. To that whispered deep affection, he responded with proud deep love, and the hands that should have been joined became joined. The boy laughed in front of Louis, who was watching it from the front row and letting out a small exhale. He laughed and said, ? Well, shall we begin? Bring it on, O inevitable fate. Arc 7, Chapter 97, Arriving from Beyond the West. Battles unfolded with the imperial capital of Lupagana as their stage, and in every single one of those locations, the climax approacheth. A dragon, clad in the very clouds themselves, swooped down to the sky where white snow was falling, and vermilion flames scorched the sky into a turbulent cloud. Stone golems were colliding against soldiers donning desperate expressions, a beast's powerful arms clashed against crafty elder malice clashing against malice riddled with craftiness arisen from age affront a collapsed rampart, the status of the conflict seesawed back and forth unending. However, at this moment, at this very instant, the greatest focal point of this battlefield laid with the innermost part of the imperial capital, the most beautiful castle in the world, known as the Crystal Palace. A white light had been emitted. Utilized throughout the entire construction of the castle were magic crystals, mana crystals purer than most magic stones. By amplifying the mana stockpile therein, the magic crystal cannon was a strategic weapon able to lay devastation upon its target. To be precise, it was the Crystal Palace's trump card, the artillery of the highest firepower within the possession of the Wallachian Empire, the ultimate attack, which could quite possibly decide the outcome of a battle with only a single shot, even in this battlefield. In the first place, only a limited number of people possessed knowledge on the existence of this magic crystal cannon. It went without saying that Abel, who had been on the seat of the emperor, and Zika Osman, to whom the outline of the operation had been conveyed to, would be aware of it. In addition, there was also Priscilla Barriel, whose possible prior awareness of this information would not strike as odd were she to actually possess it, alongside a very limited number of personnel on the side of the rebel army. Probably, things would be more or less similar on the imperial capital side. Amounting to the fake Emperor Vincent Wallachia, who led the insurrection, and his accomplice, the Prime Minister, Bastetz von Dalphon. Along with Moguro Hagane, who was the Crystal Palace itself, it was a secret weapon that even the other divine generals had not known about, and then. ? The power of the magic crystal cannon is limited to just 3 uses, but it shall not be used more than once on this battlefield. That was Abel's judgment, and therefore, an awareness Vincent shared as well. For a variety of reasons, the magic crystal cannon was the trump card of national defense in every sense. The reckless act of using up all its remaining ammo was not something that could be done with the future in mind. Of course, if Vincent intended to deplete it on this battlefield without any consideration for the future, then that was another matter. Abel, you could not possibly engage in such desperate behavior. Abel did not especially think about what to call that conviction. However, conviction was conviction, and without discarding what had budded within him, Abel had prepared the battlefield. Hence, he chose to give rise to a certainty that the magic crystal cannon, which could only be fired once, would fire a fruitless shot. That expectation had been lured out of them by the decoys, Zika, a valuable asset when it came to warring potential, the high morale soldiers under his banner, and the other various tribes, had all been put together. Abel, use the elite as decoys. The enemy shan't be able to turn a blind eye to them. Then, having seen the unfortunate turn of events at the third bastion, the magic crystal cannon was directed to the battlefield protected by Mogoro. The flaw of the magic crystal cannon was that it may cause tremendous damage even to allies, but on Mogoro's battlefield, those worries were unnecessary. Because the stone golems scattered across the battlefield were nothing but forces that had split from the divine general, and even the titanic Mogoro, who had become one with the rampart, was not the Seven's main body. Therefore, the expectations of both sides overlapped, and the magic crystal cannon would wipe out one group of rebels upon being fired. However, it would also eliminate the possibility of the rebels being defeated with nothing they could do about it. Or so it was to have passed. Abel, That instant, a large number of people on the battlefield bore witness to a black light engulfing the shot of white light. Just what had brought that about? Where had the tremendous shot disappeared to without doing a sliver of damage? Was that an action belonging to friend or foe? Countless thoughts that passed in the emptiness of mind birthed, everyone left dumbfounded as they ceased their movements. At the rebel command post, Abel was no exception. That had been an incident outside of what he had hypothesized. He, too, had had his mind enraptured by the unexpected phenomenon, and a brief emptiness was yielded in his thoughts. What was different about him was that he recovered faster than anyone else from that state. Who, how, where, he did not know any of it, but Abel, fire it up, just as planned. If one was met with a situation better than expected, there was nothing greater. In many cases, what was utmost necessary on the battlefield was a quick decision, rather than a correct decision. Then, by updating the decision based on the events that had occurred due to that very choice, it could be transformed into the correct one. Removing his gaze from the battlefield that the white light had been expected to lay wreck to, Abel gave the order. At that voice of Abel's, the stiff soldiers of the command post widened their eyes, and lowered their gazes. To the several gazes which could not conceal their trembling, Abel responded with his own black eyes through his Oni mask. Abel, fire it up immediately. Give the order. Any delay shall lead to the death of Zika Osman. Soldiers, HK. Abel, hurry, move. Soldiers, yes sir. The soldiers around and within the command center were all Zika's good subordinates. Originally, the plan had included Zika's life in the equation. It was hypocritical of him to refer to Zika's life, however, the soldiers grasped that, quickly beginning to move. Rather than Abel's decisiveness, it was the trust that Zika had built which had allowed for that. Abel, you have fulfilled your duty as Suicide Corps. Nevertheless, do not slacken your hands, Zika Osman. If you have survived, it means that you still possess a role to fulfill. In the distance, at the third bastion of the city walls that protected the imperial capital, a clash that should never have happened had occurred. A battle headed by Zika, with the people of Shudrak and many others tribes accompanying him. The battlefield had become a true contest of strength to see who would be able to break past Mogoro and into the imperial capital. Watching the unforeseen hard-fought battle from afar, Abel touched his own Oni mask, and muttered. Abel, inevitably, the role I must play is also close at hand. Behind Abel as he muttered that, the soldiers fired a magic stone cannon into the sky as they had been ordered. That was an indication of the situation having developed, a retaliation against the imperial capital's faction, who had used up their trump card, the magic crystal cannon, a sign that the rebel army's side had also played their own trump card. Beholding the cannon's light with his eyes, Abel shifted his gaze to the side opposite to the third bastion. Abel, the one who seems to have entered the board from the west, who are you? ? That surely cannot be. As he cast his eyes toward the distant battlefield from the top level of the Crystal Palace, the aged throat of Bastet's von Dalphon quivered a smidgen. The imperial prime minister, an individual who was usually unflappable, was bewildered and shaken to an extent such that it had taken the guards by his side by surprise. Bastet's ... Once he sensed the gazes of the soldiers to his side, Bastet's instantly tightened his cheeks. Displaying any sort of indolence would make light of the empire. Even if those around him did not believe likewise, as long as he himself did, he would not stand for it. That was the way of the Wallachian Empire. This was exactly how Bastet's himself envisioned an ideal Wallachia. Bastet's, naturally, since the imperial capital is being advanced on, figuring out some sort of countermeasure is a must, but getting a hold of himself, Bastet's tackled the events that transpired head-on. What had spilled from his lips was a reflection of the events that had taken place just before, a reflection on fact that the first blow of the magic crystal cannon, the trump card of the Crystal Palace, had failed to hit its mark. The existence of the magic crystal cannon was considered to be top secret, known only to very few people in the empire. However, since they had to take on the true emperor, Vincent Wallachia, the secrecy of the magic crystal cannon's existence was completely meaningless. However, even with its existence known, it was a fact that there was way to thwart the magic crystal cannon's extraordinary firepower, the value of its very existence, in the first place. Therefore, Bastet's had surmised that Vincent would either avoid a decisive battle in the imperial capital or not deploy his army in a situation where the magic crystal cannon would be used. However, Vincent had entered the battlefield. Moreover, amidst the battle, he had taken command of the rebels who had gone ahead before him. This way, he began handling the state of affairs. Presumably, pushing the expendable forces all the way into the line of fire of the magic crystal cannon had been a last resort of his. Then, seeking maximum efficiency, Bastet's had pointed the magic crystal cannon at the third bastion. Even if Vincent's plan had been to have them shoot at the area of the battlefield with the highest concentration of rebel troops, as to minimize the overall damage to his allies, the fact remained that the opponents would still suffer. Putting down the sacrificial lambs and use the power of the 9 divine generals to crush the enemy's plans. With this in mind, he had beseeched the other Vincent on the throne for forgiveness. And then, Vincent, once each side's chicanery is gone, only the sheer difference in troop strength shall remain. Do it. Seeing that Vincent and he were in agreement, Bastet's had fired the magic crystal cannon. Once homed in on a target, the burst of enormous destructive power that had been unleashed would rush into the battlefield in a flash, vaporizing many heroes in the process, supposedly sending them to the great beyond. Therefore, with victory and defeat decided after the magic crystal cannon had mowed down the rebels, he would give thought on the steps that would follow the redefinition of the battle status. However, Bastet's, the damage done by the magic crystal cannon is non-existent? Considering the achievements of the restored magic crystal cannon sealed in the Crystal Palace, it had not occurred to him that Vincent could possibly possess some means of offsetting it. Keeping cards well hidden until the last possible moment was undoubtedly Vincent's habit. Bastet's lamented over the fact he had been completely outwitted, but at the same time, he felt a rush of excitement in his heart. More than anything else, he thought. What a shame it was. Bastet's, Your Excellency, I am regretful from the bottom of my heart. Since it was the way of the Wallachian Empire to revere the strong, Vincent's approach to rule the empire with wits rather than violence as the one at its pinnacle was a combination of boredom and horror. To possess the political skills to avoid any major war was something that he himself esteemed and, at the same time, shunned. Still, he had no complaints about serving Vincent. so long as he fulfilled his duties as emperor and protected the glory of the Wallachian Empire. Bestets, what shall you do upon your return, your excellency? What would he do with the empire after returning to the throne and executing all those who had rebelled against him? Would he leave the empire as it was before, and once again relinquish his duties as emperor? Even the most outstanding emperor had no right to remain on the throne if he was content with letting that happen. Bestets, prepare the magic crystal cannon for the next shot. Since the number of charges for the magic crystal cannon was fixed, depleting them was unacceptable. Nevertheless, if the situation needed to be changed, Bestets would utilize the plenitude of his jurisdiction. However, if the opponents did possess 2 trump cards with which to counteract the magic crystal cannon, he could not make the same mistake again. Until he figured that out, he could not see it through. Soldier, Prime Minister Bestets. Look at that. Suddenly, one of the soldiers standing by Bestets raised his voice. Following the soldier's gaze, the light of the magic stones emanating in the sky far behind the battlefield could be seen, probably at the place where the rebel main camp had been positioned. It was some kind of signal. A terribly unreliable one, as the sky above the battlefield was dyed white and red, but it would be effective enough for anyone waiting for the signal to come. Bestets, a signal. Behind his narrowed eyes, Bestets surmised his opponent's intentions. After the magic cannon had fired, they would have thought the situation had supposedly changed as well. If so, was that signal an instruction to the soldiers on the front line? However, if the intention was to inform the soldiers fighting on the front lines, that signal was way too unreliable. Therefore, it was not for informing the soldiers on the front lines. Bestets, reinforcements. But simultaneously, Bestets gave it careful rumination. With the majority of the rebels who had gathered from all over the country already wreaking havoc on the battlefield, with that group having already been crushed by the power of the 9 divine generals, what kind of forces could function as reinforcements? Reinforcements were not pieces one would simply withhold. They ought to be a trump card in the proper sense, deployed to change the war situation in decisive fashion. Of course, they were meaningless lest they packed a sufficient punch. Just what kind of forces could they possibly be? With those thoughts, Bestets widened his slit-like eyes and turned them to the distant west. Bestets, it cannot be. Slowly reflected in Bestets's vision as he muttered faintly, were shadows arriving from the western sky, spread across a vast expanse of those skies, were the supreme rulers of the sky making their calm approach. A flock of flying dragons. A large number of flying dragons resided in the Wallachian Empire. However, taming a flying dragon required treasured techniques and masterful skills, and the one who had gathered many of those under their banner was a leading noble, who possessed preeminent power within the empire. A high countess who had refused to participate in the decisive battle for the imperial capital, on the grounds of maintaining order within her own territory, the one in command of the empire's strongest flying dragon squadron. Bestets, High Countess Serena Drakroy, is it? Spotting a dragon ship sporting flaming red sails among the flying dragon squadron approaching from beyond the sky, Bestets understood the threat of the reinforcements that the rebels had prepared. When it came to controlling flying dragons, his faction also possessed one of the 9 divine generals, Madeleine Ischart. In front of said dragonkin, all flying dragons were slaves to her will. However, the only exceptions to that were the flying dragons who had forged bonds with a tamer, through the technique of flying dragon taming. Bestets, even so, it would merely be a struggle for air supremacy. No, if she has summoned the cloud dragon, then that presumption must also change. Despite the shock of the magic crystal cannon's nullification, Bestets had not neglected his grasp of the battlefield. During the fierce battles that had unfolded at the 5 bastions, even the colors of the heavens and the earth had experienced erratic changes due to various battlefields. And in one of those battles, the descent of the mighty dragon had been spotted. As a dragonkin, Madeleine was able to summon the dragon which was connected to her ancestors. Up until now, she had never called the cloud dragon Mazoya to the ground. Her summoning it would change the flow of the battle, drastically. Of course, The circumstances under which Madeline would summon Mazoya were impossible to intuit, meaning it was possible that simply driving her into a corner could suffice. Bastetts, be that as it may, in the case that flying dragons fight each other for air supremacy. In both quantity and quality, Bastetts believed that they held the advantage. The determined decision of High Countess Serena Dracroy to side with the rebels must have been a rage-inducing mistake for the men of Wallachia, yet. Bastetts, Thinking this, Bastetts was staring towards the western sky as he realized something. He had been completely fixated on the slowly approaching flying dragon squadron, but that had not been the sole change that had occurred in the west. A closer look to the hills to the west revealed the shape of a group deploying anew. For a moment, they appeared to be the forces of High Countess Dracroy, but Bastetts quickly changed his mind as it became evident that this was not the case. The reason for that was simple. The flag that group was hosting. It sported neither the crest of High Countess Dracroy, that of a flying dragon with a scar on its cheek, nor the national emblem of the Wallachian Empire, the wolf pierced by swords, but an entirely different flag. Slightly troubled by what was portrayed on it, Bastetts said. "Bastetts, is that a star?" "Oi bro, what are you doing? We're completely late already?" "Stop with the fussin' lizard bastard. Schwartz is in the middle of something." "Sure, he's in the middle of something, but Hyan has a point. What are we going to do? Should we join the ranks of the rebel army like this?" "Wow, do you see that, boss? The right and left are all over the place. It truly is a great, decisive battle. Where should we go? I can't stop my chest from throbbing." "Subaru, shut up. Can't you see that I'm in a very moving scene right now?" As a group of familiar voices barged in, making a huge ruckus, Natsuki Subaru rebuked them. He was reminded how dangerously accustomed he had become to being Natsuki Schwartz these days. Although Natsuki Schwartz was ultimately just an alias, he felt strongly about his real name, the one he ought to be called by, being Natsuki Subaru. "Rather. Subaru, it's fine to take that as you calling my name, right? Louis, wow. You are you tilde. Subaru, I get it. I get it already, so don't spill your snot all over me. Yuck." So Subaru responded, and with force he pushed away the face of the blonde-haired girl clinging to him, Louis, as she drenched him in her tears and snot. But he was unable to shake Louis off with full resolve, since he was also greatly indebted to her for the far too valuable contributions she had amassed. Subaru had already asked too many things of Louis he could not make amends for. Although he could exculpate himself for having no other recourse. "Subaru, if I do that, I don't deserve to face you. So I'll do it right. Louis, tilde." As she rested her forehead while clinging on to Subaru's back, Louis groaned. Whether that was her way of forgiving him, or whether she was just happy to be reunited with him, Subaru sighed, accepting that she did not seem to harbor any negative feelings. Not only did he have to apologize to Louis, but he also owed her many thanks. But the one he was most thankful for. "Subaru, Beatrice." Tightly, he hugged her and invoked her name, stroking her ample hair. The one true reason why the owner of such a sheer volume of curly hair and a gorgeous dress, a little girl ill-fitted to the battlefield, was present on it was, no matter how one looked at it, Subaru. She had certainly done something incredibly reckless, for her to come near to disappearing as she had. That was why? Beatrice, Subaru. As those lips uttered his name indeed, Subaru breathed a sigh of relief. His name was truly Natsuki Subaru, once again. "Excuse me, Schwartz-summer? Subaru, you were..." Feeling relieved, Subaru's shoulders jumped upon hearing an unexpected whisper close to his ear. He turned around by reflex, and present there was a lovely, familiar face, Tanza's. The dear girl clad in a kimono stared at Subaru with her usual expressionless face, while the latter sat on his butt holding Beatrice in his arms, and with Louis clung to his back. "Tanza, I apologize for interrupting your amusement. But Hyan Summer and the others are correct. We do not have enough time to spare for leisure activities. Subaru, leisure activities? Isn't that a bit harsh? Tanza, we do not have enough time to spare for leisure activities. Subaru, sorry, my bad. I understand your feelings, Tanza. Yorna-san will probably also be somewhere on this battlefield. Rushed by a cold, firm voice, Subaru admitted his wrongdoing, displaying his understanding. Thereupon, Tanza slightly lowered her round eyebrows and muttered, "Yes." Tanza, who had ended up accompanying Subaru following a series of events, was a girl who had originally been a servant to Yorna Mishigya, the ruler of the demon city of Chaos Flame. While suppressing her desire to meet up with Yorna as soon as possible, Tanza had joined Subaru on his journey, and finally, their reunion was close at hand. Being in such a restless state of mind, it was fairly understandable of her to feel the urge to interrupt Subaru, who was getting a head start on his own joyful reunion. However, Beatrice, Subaru, what is the deal with this impertinent dear girl? Writhing in Subaru's arms, Beatrice looked up at Tanza, declaring thus in a somewhat dissatisfied voice. Promptly, Tanza gazed towards Beatrice. Tanza, my name is Tanza. Due to a series of events, I have been serving as Schwartz Summer's attendant. Beatrice, humph, I understand, in fact. Thank you for your hard work, I suppose. From now on, Betty and the others will take care of Subaru, so you can consider yourself dismissed, in fact. Tanza, you will take care of him. In that state? It appears like you cannot even move properly without Schwartz Summer holding you in his arms. Beatrice, Subaru's purpose in life is to hold on to Betty, so this is fine, I suppose. Subaru, wait, why are we fighting? As fellow little girls, shouldn't you get along? For some reason, a perilous atmosphere had broken out all of a sudden between the two girls. Caught in the middle, Subaru's voice involuntarily cracked. For Tanza, typically composed as she was, this attitude was both unbefitting and unendearing, but in a good way. Not that Subaru was unaware that he should not tell a young girl how immature she was being. Subaru, Tanza, Beatrice, don't fight, you two. You're allies, both of you. Come on. Tanza, Beatrice Summer was poking her nose first. Also, Yorna Summer told me to respond in kind to contemptible people who act heedlessly. Subaru, she really told such a code of Hammurabi type of thing? I didn't know that. Then, you should be sorry. Beatrice? 1. Subaru attempted to mediate between them as Beatrice's round eyes stared at him motionlessly. Enthralled by the characteristic pattern of her pupils, Subaru tilted his neck, asking what's wrong. Then, Beatrice's lips trembled and quivered, and she spoke. Beatrice, just now, you called that girl's name before Betty's, in fact. What's the meaning of this, I suppose? Subaru, huh? Did I? Beatrice, you did, in fact. How utterly infuriating, I suppose. I won't stand for this no matter what, in fact. Her eyes flaring up in anger, Beatrice grabbed his collar and shook her head back and forth. Upon hearing this unexpected ruling, Subaru also became dizzy. And then, getting fed up with this back and forth going absolutely nowhere. Schwartz, even I, as the official, have limits to my patience. You should be aware of this, correct? Beatrice, Maya. Subaru, oh. A baritone, oppressive voice fell upon them. Beatrice screamed even before Subaru. Tracing Beatrice's baffled gaze, Subaru understood her surprise. Standing there, in a black overcoat with 4 folded arms, was a stern-faced Gustave Morello staring down at them. Being the governor of the Gladiator Island, his position would normally be that of keeping Subaru and his men captive, yet he now was a collaborator of those who were now brazenly traveling outside of the island. No, he was a comrade of theirs. This was not limited to just him. Gathered at that very place was not only the large number of people accompanying Subaru from the Gladiator Island, but also companions who had joined them in the meantime as comrades. Beatrice, Subaru, this man. Subaru, that's Gustav-san. He looks scary, but at his core he's frighteningly diligent. Gustav-san, the one on my back is Louis, and this girl is Beatrice. She's my. Gustav, you're. Subaru, I mean, you know, that. Stroking Beatrice's back as she curled up, Subaru was at a loss for words, coming up with an explanation for Gustav. Witnessing that, Gustav, Tanza and Beatrice all frowned. At the numerous stares directed towards him, Subaru awkwardly scratched his head and. Subaru, I'll fill you in on the details later. Gustav, hey now. Beatrice, wait, I suppose. Subaru, could it be that not only your appearance, but also your mind has been slightly. Gustav accepted Subaru's overly sloppy misdirection in his overly serious way of being, but, as Beatrice was about to hit the nail too straight on the head, Subaru covered her mouth. And then, he whispered to Beatrice's ear, who was struggling noisily. Subaru, explaining that I've shrunken is going to be complicated. So I'm going to keep it to myself for now. Beatrice, do you really remember Betty, in fact? Subaru, I really do love you, that's why I have to do this. Seeing Beatrice's questioning look, Subaru replied, then squeezed her hand, intertwining the fingers of his small hand with those of Beatrice's also small hand. As soon as he did so, Subaru was momentarily assaulted by a dizzying sense of emptiness. But it did not last forever, only the initial pang had been large. Subaru, I couldn't go on living without you. Isn't that so? Beatrice, Betty gets the feeling you're quite skilled at pulling the wool over her eyes, I suppose. Besides. Subaru, besides? Beatrice, Subaru, something is off, in fact. Warmth flowed from within Subaru to Beatrice as they held each other's hands in front of one another. Instinctively, Subaru was aware that this was not a bad thing, but rather a reassurance. His memory of Beatrice had become slightly hazy in some parts, as only some details had become blurry, but he was somewhat optimistic it would all be all right once his body was returned to normal. In any case, close to Subaru as he viewed the situation in such a positive view, Beatrice furrowed her shapely brow, apparently pondering something. Subaru, as adorable as your thinking expression is, what exactly feels off? Beatrice, Subaru, while you were separated from Betty, you had no method of expelling mana, I suppose. So it was natural for mana to pile up, but this amount is. Subaru, Beatrice's long eyelashes trembled as she tightened her fingers as if to confirm. Before Subaru, whose head was tilted, her lips spilled a voice bereft of sound. Certainly, she had muttered something of this sort. That it was too much. But before the truth of the situation could be ascertained. Hyun, bro, bad news. That Cecilus guy went ahead. Subaru, wha? Hyun's shrill voice rose like a scream, and Subaru hurriedly turned his head. Hyun pointed in the direction his own gaze was being cast, to a battlefield where fierce relentless clashes ensued unending, a cloud of dust raging on towards it without stopping. It was the evidence of an impatient, unruly boy rushing down the hillside. Whites, what now? Should I bring him back or? Subaru, no, as much as I appreciate your thoughts, that'd be too much for you, Whites. To begin with, it's impossible for anyone to stop Ceci. Flag. Idra, got you, Schwartz. While harboring annoyed thoughts at the distant cloud of dust, Subaru took into consideration the positive aspects of the boy's rampage, since he knew full well from his journey so far that would be unable to rein him in. Having regained his composure, Subaru made his next request, and it was Idra who moved keenly. Alongside Whites, they slowly raised the flag right there. And this action was followed by a massive number of their comrades in arms surrounding them. Flag after flag was raised. To those in their environs, the appearance would be that the group upon the hillside was firmly united. Subaru, Louis, could you get off my back? Louis, Subaru, I'm not going to disappear out of the blue again, I assure you. I've made peace with what caused me to get whisked away. Subaru persuaded Louis, who was still traumatized by his disappearance and reluctant to leave Subaru's back. She was still skeptical, but in the end, she left Subaru's back by her own will. Still, her reluctance was evident of a certain lack of trust. Beatrice, Betty has no intention of ever leaving, in fact. Subaru, yeah, you stay with me. Tanza, is everything ready? Tanza, yes. The Pleiades battalion is ready to go at any time, too. Behind the bowing Tanza, Subaru smiled to himself as he watched his comrades raise their flags, their weapons, and their fighting spirits. Their morale was high, their motivation filled to the brim, their objective was in sight. All that was left was to seize it. Subaru, since Ceci probably knows my plan without me telling him each and every detail, that's just his usual amusement. Well, let's get started, everyone. Everyone, yeah. Beatrice, HK, there was a tremendous response to Subaru's call, as Beatrice's breath got caught in her throat. If one were to hear it for the first time, this would come as a guaranteed surprise. However, Subaru's ears had already grown accustomed to it, and it was a very important pre-fight ritual. Louis, wow? Beatrice, Subaru, just what do you intend on doing, I suppose? Louis and Beatrice, who had just joined Subaru, looked up at him, not knowing the details of the situation. Closing a single eye as to meet their gaze, Subaru took a step forward, excitement welling up from deep within his body, which he firmly contained in his slender legs. And then, he declared, Subaru, isn't it obvious? We're gonna ruin this stupid war that my shitty father started. Arc 7, Chapter 98, The Pleiades Battalion. The Kingdom of Lagunica, the Wallachian Empire, the Holy Kingdom of Gusteco, and the Kararagai city-states. Each of these nations, commonly referred to as the Four Great Countries, had developed its own culture, which was tailored to its land, most notably, the pro-dragon mentality of the Kingdom of Lagunica and the spirit faith of the Holy Kingdom of Gusteco. The Four Great Countries had taken different paths, as if by design. This was true not only in terms of national culture and style, but also in terms of the quality of warriors. In the Wallachian Empire, magic had hardly developed at all. The gate and other prerequisites in their bodies were no different from those of other countries, no matter whether they were across the border or not, but compared to Lagunica and Kararagai, the Empire lagged far behind the others in this area. The Empire, however, did not take that fact to heart. Of course, falling behind other countries in any field was not welcome, but the fact that the field of magic was not developed meant that other fields were developed instead. Compared to the technological prowess of the Kararagai city-states, the spirit arts and curse arts of the Holy Kingdom of Gusteco, and the magical disciplines of the Kingdom of Lagunica, the Wallachian Empire excelled in martial arts. Sometimes it's faster to just swoop in and hit them than to use magic, right? And, while this not spiritual arts users-like statement could be fully affirmed, this was close to the general attitude towards magic in the Wallachian Empire, though this was highly misunderstood, and kind of the fact that was not being stipulated as well. The use of mana in the human body was not only limited to casting magic. A small number of martial arts techniques were based on it, in the same way it was used in spirit arts, curse arts, and in the activation of some meteors. It was perfectly natural for an elite warrior, especially, to use mana to strengthen his own body. At times, if one who possessed unnatural physical abilities were compared to ordinary people, the trick was the handling of the mana that circulated within the body, a technique called the flow method, which was done consciously. However, cha-cha-cha-cha. With a thump, only 1 foot touched the ground, and in an instant the distance closed by 12 meters. If one were to track the figure from the side, it would seem as if time had been stolen, with its extraordinary body movements, but this was neither an illusion nor an optical illusion. The anomaly was none other than the blue-haired boy who ran through the battlefield. Following the explanation given immediately before, the boy's sprinting, which effortlessly transcended human limitations, must have been the result of the flow method. However, beneath the boy's young age and sharp good looks, there appeared no record of the days spent learning such techniques. Rarely in the world were there such beings. There were those who were born unknowingly exercising the flow method, which was even said to be one of the ultimate martial arts, and would leave those who were caught up in the natural law behind. Running down the hillside in a single breath, the boy plunged into the battlefield in search of the honor of the first spear. Although, blue-haired boy, if the battle has already begun, the honor of being the first spear is nothing, but let's not worry about the details. He broke into the battlefield from the western lands and gazed at the great army surrounding the star-shaped walls in the distance. The long, slitted eyes of the boy were blazing and wet with excitement that would never be felt in a battlefield where grief and joy alternated. A being that went into battle without proper footwear, without armor or a helmet, without a cause of any kind, it was a barbaric act that could be seen as hostile by both those inside and outside the walls, those who wanted to protect the current empire and those who wanted to destroy it. However, blue-haired boy, the high level of ambition is a point worthy of note. With or without it, the appeal of your speech that flows from your mouth changes. It's just. What? In red gear and crude armor, there were skirmishes between small groups of dozens each who were clearly hostile to each other. A boy interrupted from the side, and a soldier wielding a sword cried out. An admirably clear tone of voice, a mixture of anger, frustration, excitement, but with a fighting spirit prevailing. It was a clever move that called for caution against an intruder on the battlefield. Blue-haired boy, but it's fatally slow. WH. It was correct to shout, but wrong to stop and ask who they were. It was only right that any being who appeared on the battlefield without revealing his or her allegiance should be assumed to be an enemy. The soldier should not have only alerted his surroundings, but also slashed at the sound of the voice. Still, the enemy was faster, and if one needed to, they could point to 10 or 20 other faults. Blue-haired boy, oh, and if what you just said was a line that came out because you didn't ask my affiliation, but because you had no idea who I was, then I'm sorry for being too lightning fast, I would say. A soldier opening his whitened eyes fell to the ground behind the non-stop babbling boy. As they passed each other, he drove his hand akin to a sharp blade into his neck. He expected to be able to chop his head off, but the blow was not powerful enough. Shaking and swinging his arms around, he twisted his head as he felt that something was off after all. Blue-haired boy, it's so frustrating when you feel like you can do something but you can't. Not that I have any plans to mix up my ideals and wishes with what's realistically feasible. Well, if I accidentally let him die, I will sink in boss's estimation, so let's call it a good result. Immediately after shaking off his uncertainty so brusquely, the laughing boy's figure turned into a blur. A moment later, he avoided a sword strike descending on his position, and the back of the boy's zori hit the soldier's face from the side, launching him in the opposite direction. The boy leapt off the soldier as he kicked him, and landed within the group behind following the soldier, striking each of their vital points with a single blow before disengaging, just to slip right into the next group, cutting off the consciousness of another 5 or so. It all happened in the blink of an eye. Both the follow-up and the main objective were a criminal act to bereave the surrounding soldiers of their time. In other words, the mastery of this boy over his own body was beyond human comprehension and could not be pursued with raw strength. One could call it the ultimate lineage of martial arts developed in the Wallachian Empire. Of course, it was not so easy for anyone to analyze such a situation on the battlefield, or to swallow the fact that a child of 12 or 13 years could be capable of such a thing. Above anything else, blue-haired boy, tactless. Blue-haired boy, it's not tactful to try to undermine the skill and good looks of a star actor during his performance. On stage, nothing more is needed than to be admired, to enthrall and captivate. Of course, if I were to ascend to the stage in the same way, I would have to assert a more flamboyant appearance by means of an opponent worthy of it. The group gasped at the boy frowning down upon his surroundings in the center of the slowly crumbling Imperial Guard. The soldiers, who should have been clashing weapons and fighting for their lives, on both sides were overwhelmed by the boy's presence and bereaved not only of their time, but their very lives. Blue-haired boy, no, the blessing of an actor. To bereave others of their lives, the boy got a certain satisfaction from that sensation. As the boy was savoring this sense of accomplishment, among the numerous defeated soldiers bereft of their time within opposing the Imperial Guard was one poorly armed warrior who opened his mouth and said, "You. Soldier, where's this guy from? Is he one of ours?" Blue-haired boy, whose side am I on? That's quite a good question from you. What do you think I am? Friend or foe? Soldier, .. The warrior clammed up when his question was returned with another question in such a can't-be-bothered manner. The boy's smile deepened at this, and he shook his head, "No, no. Blue-haired boy, I wasn't teasing you. I just thought about it seriously too. I constantly think about that stuff. I didn't really listen to the boss, so I don't really know who is on my side." Soldier, huh? Blue-haired boy, so for now, I'm just gonna act as the herald of justice for both sides. The warrior's eyes rolled back, then his startled face blurred on the side, and the next moment he was flipped over onto the ground. The smirking boy's figure was swept away, and this time he slipped into a group of warriors who had been fighting the Imperial soldiers he had just defeated, and furiously mowed them down. As the blue hair danced and the sound of sharp strikes seemingly echoed through the air, the consciousnesses of the warriors were erased without as much as a bitter cry. This violence was just like a storm, no. ? A blue thunderbolt. Blue-haired boy, oh, marvelous. That's exactly the alias I was thinking of calling myself, too. The warrior, who spilled a breath snatched in shock, was rendered unconscious by the end of those words. It was the Volakian way to respond to both friendly and hostile attitudes with equal violence, yet, this savagery would probably even make the emperor of this country raise his eyebrows. But no one was capable of stopping the boy. Yet it remained absolutely the correct thing to do according to the imperial way. ? Oh. The warriors responded late to the threat posed by that small whirlwind of a boy. No longer were there any distinctions between imperial soldiers and rebels, but everyone was united in the thought of stopping that boy. It was, in a sense, the scene of a great achievement, stopping a civil war single-handedly, if only in this small space. However, the steeled resolve of these heroes was not met with a peaceful answer. Lean back to avoid the blade. Dance backwards to avoid fist strikes. Slip between the legs to avoid axe blows. Dodge arrows, dodge spears, dodge fangs, dodge shields, avoid, duck, evade, dodge. Without any weapon. Blue-haired boy, yeah, that is quite a predicament. I would like to embellish my highlight poses by showing off my skills with a weapon rather than with my bare hands, but I don't want to use something half-baked either. After all, the best only know the best. Look at me sounding like the boss. ? Bosu? Blue-haired boy, right, he is the Pleiades battalion's leader. The boy's smile grew deeper as he boasted, effortlessly dodging the killing intent and hostility being hurled at him. The unfamiliar words uttered by the boy's mouth filled the warriors with a sense of inexplicable fear. Any of them should have been willing to risk their own lives in the battle to decide the course of this empire. Nevertheless, they did not know the affiliation of the boy toying with them, the limit to his strength, the true meaning of his words and deeds, or anything else. Even though they did not know what was going on, everything seemed to be going the way the boy wanted it to. The next moment, a tremendous war cry was heard from the direction of the hills in the far distance. Who could blame the warrior for shuddering with a HK? The same turmoil and confusion spread to the other warriors as well. Hence, the smile on the boy's mouth became larger, not because he mocked the frightened state of the warriors, but due to something more straightforward. Blue-haired boy, well, that concludes the first climax, boss. Make sure to finish it off flamboyantly. At this point, it is necessary to mention a very unfortunate fact about magic. This is a different issue from the one described previously, where the Wallachian Empire has developed only physical martial arts and the flow method instead of magical techniques. Among the 6 distinguished magic attributes in this world, there may be a lack of practitioners of yin magic and yang magic, but there are other reasons for their neglect beyond them being hard to investigate. Manipulating temperature, the fire attribute produces flames and even ice. Interfering with an organism's life force, the water attribute facilitates the healing of wounds and illnesses, saving lives. Arranging with the environment by interfering with the atmosphere, the wind attribute can even secure habitable areas from inhospitable regions. Manipulating the earth's power, the earth attribute can fertilize as well as starve out the land. Compared to each of those attributes with a clear image to indicate their usage, the yin and yang attributes are basically thought of as effects that either enhance or hamper the performance of one's body. While that is technically a misconception, the fact that such an image has taken hold is a major factor in the lack of progress in the development of the respective yin and yang magic attributes today. And this might come as a surprise, the one that continually receives a reputation for being especially out of place and useless is the yang attribute, the power to enhance people's capabilities. Knowing the primary effects of yang magic, many may be tempted to question its assessment. However, the more one tries to take advantage of the features of yang magic, the bigger and more unavoidable its problems become. For example, when it comes down to performance on the battlefield, those who enhanced their physical abilities via yang magic were utterly defeated by the enemy in most cases. The reason was simple: they could not handle their own enhanced bodies at all, and were unable to demonstrate their strength whatsoever as if they were in control of someone else's body. Enhancing one's abilities may be summed up as strengthening the 5 senses, such as eyesight and hearing, enhancing physical abilities, such as arm and leg strength, and strengthening defenses, such as increasing bone and muscle density. However, warriors always train their own bodies and confront the battlefield with complete grasp of their own skills. As for those who received yang magic, they would discard their normal selves and head to the battlefield in a new body with only enhanced specs. As a result, many of them died without achieving anything. This problem goes even further as the efficacy of yang magic is greatly affected by the skill of the caster themselves, as well as their physical and mental condition that day. Even if a warrior who has received yang magic can adapt to his enhanced body, there is no guarantee that the identical enhancement by the same caster on the very next day will be as effective. Yang magic is not expected to improve one's ability to fight consistently; on the contrary, it is recognized as a flaw that prevents one from satisfactorily demonstrating one's usual abilities. This is the reason why yang magic had been neglected. In the past, the Wallachian Empire also focused its attention on the power of magic, and had an emperor who looked forward to constructing the most powerful army. The 31st emperor of the Wallachian Empire, Mercia Wallachia, planned to use yang magic to turn a powerful army into an even more powerful one. Taking into account the aforementioned shortcomings, he enlisted yang magic users into his powerful army, trained them so that their enhanced state would become their natural state, and then went into actual battle. However, the unfolding results had been disastrous. The powerful army became dependent on the enhancement and was defeated before any yang magic could be applied. The skills of the essential casters varied. The troops were also assaulted by great numbers as they could not function as troops, and even the emperor's life had been in jeopardy. The war finally ended when Viva the Dissector, a close ally of the then Emperor of Wallachia, defeated the enemy general, but because of this colossal defeat, Mercia Wallachia was engraved into history with his ignominious alias, the Emperor of the Great Defeat. Because of this precedent, the value of yang magic, and thus magic as a whole, was devalued in Wallachia, leading to the spread of the idea that mastery of martial arts was the mark of a strong soldier. This had not changed to this day, and Vincent Wallachia, with all his wisdom, had dismissed the use of yang magic in group battles as something that was beyond consideration. In fact, when a user of yang magic can only enhance one target at a time, the operation of an army that requires a plurality of soldiers working in unison becomes a pipe dream. Therefore, yin magic remained as a means of harassment in the sense of inflicting unusual physical effects on the enemy, and magic declined in the Wallachian Empire. Even in other countries, yang magic was considered a cursed practice that was seldom used except for self-enhancement. However, as with everything, there were exceptions. Let's do it, you guys. With a large inhale, the boy's voice, yet to have reached its full volume, was raised in the hills off to the distant west of the battlefield. With the boy in their heart, the warriors who spread out atop the hill, a band of no fewer than several thousand people raised their flag, one after the other, for the sake of expressing the unity and will of the group. A symbol of a will to fight that must never subside, one of the large flags was also held aloft beside the boy by a man whose body was covered in tattoos, accompanied by a grey lizard man, and a man with a dull appearance that yet contained a dignified look in his eyes. Depicted on the hoisted flag, recognizable even from a distance, was an emblem with the shape of a star. It was not the crest of one's family nor the crest of the nation, but merely the proof of where their hearts lay, a declaration of war of that kind, and naught else. The group assembled was a diverse one. Without exaggeration, it was composed of many races. Even within Wallachia, where a gargantuan number of species lived and coexisted, there were few relationships consisting of cooperation across racial boundaries. One of the few exceptions which had been able to function as a city was the demon city of Chaos Flame, and even during the siege of the imperial capital, there had been no semblance of cooperation among the rebels. And yet, this group was different. One could look at it as if they were merely working together for the sake of the same goal. However, that alone would not be able to gather them under a flag to demonstrate their collective will. It was not that they possessed the same goals, rather, they possessed a shared will. Hence why this group, nay, why the Pleiades Battalion, was capable of serving as a trump card. Spearheading those banners and the comrades he had gathered, a boy of black hair, Natsuki Subaru, exclaimed, "Subaru, we are the strongest. Pleiades, strongest. Strongest. Strongest." A war cry was raised in unison, thundering throughout the sky, as tremendous fighting spirits spread through the battlefield like tongues of flame. Beatrice, embraced within Subaru's arms as he yelled, covered her ears, staring in amazement. Likewise, Louis also jumped onto Subaru, though only those two young girls were surprised. "Subaru, we are invincible. Pleiades, invincible. Invincible. Invincible." Hyan, Whites, Idra, Gustav, Orson's group, Old Man Null, Rex, Milzak, Casho, Moitzo, Deroy, Kreekin, Kadro, Finmel, Jorsra, and Tanza, each one of them roared loudly. The ground quaked as they stamped their feet upon the soil, the quaking beckoning further quakening, as they roused their fighting spirit. The recesses of his chest were burning. That burning, oh so burning, promising, irresistible something, coursed through the entirety of his body, letting that burning, promising, irresistible something ride off his tongue. "Subaru, oh inevitable far eight. Pleiades, bring it on. Bring it on. Bring it on." The group bellowed in unison, and all of their eyes turned to the fore, to the battlefield at the foot of the hill. And then, "Subaru, here we go." The sensation of the sky, the ground, and the world shaking was felt by everyone on the battlefield at that moment. Among those who could not treat it as somebody else's problem were those on the western ramparts who would face head-on the flag-bearing groups running down the hillside, in other words, the imperial soldiers that had been ordered to defend the fourth bastion, which was closest to them. But not giving in to their fighting spirit, Gada Dialmo, the imperial general second-class tiger hunter, held his ground. For a moment, he was overwhelmed by the sudden appearance and high morale of the opposition. However, the imperial soldiers, the subordinates of the tiger hunter, were not so amateur to be overwhelmed by some ammunition. Above all, The wear and tear on Gada and his men was almost minimal as far as this battlefield was concerned. The imperial capital had been under tremendous siege, but the harsh attacks made against the other bastions had had almost no effect on this fourth bastion. This was undoubtedly the achievement of Olbart Dunkel Ken, who reigned as the guardian of the fourth bastion, and could be called a demonstration of the vicious old man's capabilities. In the first place, it's a good idea to cut off the opponent's legs before they even make it here. Basic rule of warfare's sever everything you don't need fight, whether water or weapons. The vicious old man described the reason why the enemy's offensive was overwhelmingly weak compared to other bastions with such a cruelty that it sent chills down the spines of the troops imagining the horror of not being on the same side as him. However, even Olbart had been required to rush to another bastion to fulfill his role of protecting the imperial capital in the case that it was about to be overrun. Therefore, the fourth bastion currently lacked the power of the 9 divine generals, the greatest strength of the empire. Olbart's legacy, his trained superhuman shinobi, needed to deal with the flying dragon squadron that had appeared from the sky in the same west as the approaching army. Since they did not have any firearms, the shinobi's techniques were their only means of defending themselves against the flying dragon squadron. And against the group that was fiercely rushing in. Gada, I'll deal with you with all my soul. With these words, Gada Dielmo stared at the enemy in front of him, carrying the signature armament of the Tiger Hunter, 2 metal clubs each weighing nearly 100 kilograms. Gada's alias was attributed to the fact that when he was still a general 3rd class, he had decimated a group of tiger men who were tyrannizing the country, and took the head of the enemy general who had killed the general 2nd class that had been in command. As a result of that heroic fight to the death, the muscular body of the over 2-meter-tall Gada was scarred from head to belly with white tiger claw marks, so he came to be known as the Tiger Hunter after word of that fierce battle had spread. Gada's will to fight had remained unshaken even as his army was on the verge of collapse after its general had been killed. So why would he be afraid of being outnumbered with something to bear right behind him? Gada, we'll take you on. With a yell like a cannon firing, Gada's huge body kicked off the ground and closed in on the enemy horde. Following Gada's lead, his subordinates, each carrying their weapons of choice, rushed toward the starry flag that was approaching from the west. Gada, that one. As he approached the moment of impact with his own feet, Gada looked closely at the vanguard of the enemy, a red galewind horse that was charging in front of the group, causing the ground to rumble. What caught his attention was not the man pulling the reins of the galewind horse. The man was merely a reinsman. Rather, what warranted his attention was the small figure the man riding on the galewind horse carried. It was a black-haired boy holding a girl in his arms and looking straight at them with his dark eyes. In that moment, the only thought passing through Gada's mind was that the boy was neither running ahead nor deviating from his position, but was charging forward as if it were natural for him to be in that position. A boy with black hair and black eyes, just like the black-haired crown prince in the rumor that had been spread since before the start of the war. Gada, HK. Gada killed off the thought by biting his teeth and focused on what he had to do. Taking advantage of a ridiculous rumor, the rebels had prepared a large number of black-haired crown princes and foolishly challenged the imperial capital to a decisive battle. Therefore, the generals who had been tasked with defending the capital, or rather, all the generals and soldiers, had made up their minds. The authenticity of the black-haired child is of no concern. There is but one emperor we ought to look up to. Gada, to backstab our Emperor Vincent Wallachia, you damned traitors. Dual-wielding his 2 heavy metal clubs, Gada roared like a tiger, the symbol he hunted in his name, and approached the boy charging at the front of the pack. In front of them was a boy riding a red galewind horse whom the rebels were following. Being a general himself, Gada wanted to crush the enemy's fighting spirit with a single blow by mowing them all down. The impact of the strike was so tremendous that it blasted weak eardrums. Gada's thick arms also felt a satisfying response, but his eyes widened. The black-haired boy was supposed to be crushed together with the galewind horse, but what the metal clubs caught was neither him nor the galewind horse he was riding. I have to protect Schwartz, as it is now my main duty. With a body larger than his own and 4 thick, strong arms, he held a large shield in his hand, which he used to directly block the blow, or rather, both blows from Gudda's metal clubs. Gudda's throat choked up at the astonishing sight, even taking into account the physical capabilities of the multi-arm clan. Slipping into that momentary delay. And. It's my job to beat up Schwartz's enemies. Gudda, HK. His voice, hushed yet courageous, and filled with a strong sense of pride and honor, struck Gudda in the torso, launching his huge body into the sky. The man who Gudda saw strike him as he let out a gar had tattoos all over his body and wielded a large two-handed hammer. He was well trained. But with his physique and amateurish movements, how could he have known? The correct thing to question was not merely what had happened to his own body. Rebels, who or are? Gudda, who had taken the lead, was blown away, and the clashes between the rebels and imperial soldiers continued afterwards. Even if Gudda's head were to be chopped off, he had trained his men well enough not to lose their will to fight. It was precisely because of this pride that they could hardly believe their own eyes. All at once, before they could even mount a decent resistance, the imperial soldiers were utterly crushed and pulverized by the offense of the oncoming rebel horde. The sight was so shocking that Gudda's entire body was filled with an indignation greater than the time when he had seen the head of his general crushed to bits right before his eyes. Gudda, this is absurd. And so, the battle-hardened general let out a hoarse breath at an utterly incomprehensible sight. As with everything, there were exceptions. The exception was the Pleiades Battalion, a threatening group of amateurs that crushed the fierce general, Gudda Dielmo, and the strong warriors he had trained. They didn't have any techniques they had trained, nor did they have fine armaments, nor did they even have a firm cause. All they had was a really, really strong will to unite, and a vow to themselves that they would not back down no matter what. And that was precisely the kind of thing that made the Pleiades Battalion an extraordinary group of people. Recall the lengthy lecture on the shortcomings of Yang magic. Its use, which depended on the skill of the caster and the number of people, and often disrupted people's coordination of their various operations, was called foolish as it had earned the former emperor the stigmatic moniker of Emperor of the Great Defeat, and even Vincent Wallachia, who was proclaimed as a wise emperor, quickly abandoned the idea of using it at the consideration stage. But what if, hypothetically, something like it was possible? All of the hundreds, or even thousands of troops would be given a uniform enhancement of the same effectiveness, and yet all of them would not suffer from the gap between their original fighting ability and the skill level of their strengthened selves. And, the key would be that there would not be the need to have the same number of Yang magic users as the number of troops. If such dreamlike or miraculous conditions were met, would it not be feasible? It was a pipe dream that Vincent Wallachia would laugh at and discard if he heard it, a group of incidental coincidences that would even be said to be possible only in this time of war, in this situation, in this circumstance. Only those who accepted Natsuki Subaru, or rather, Natsuki Schwartz, as the center of themselves, who sincerely thought of him as their friend, and who sincerely believed in him as their companion, would be able to achieve a miracle. The strengthening effect of the Yang magic would be applied to each of the individuals Subaru shared the effect of Corleonis with, that was, all of his friends who worked together with him. The power of the little king, originally intended to share wounds and burdens, would now be exploited to use the power that the king alone could not handle, together with his friends that supported him. Hence, the Pleiades Battalion. Subaru, I love you, all of you. The thousands of non-combatants who traveled with Natsuki Subaru were transformed into an army of warriors and began to lay waste to every battlefield in this battle for the imperial capital. Arc 7, Chapter 99, Those Who Rule the Sky. The word war cry was appropriate. Quite simply, it was just a yell. An exclamation raised to inspire oneself, one's allies, and a troop's morale in the face of a match, contest, or any kind of bout. It provided courage and strength to move forward. Forming a circle before a fight and raising a battle cry before charging onto the battlefield, a magic ritual for coming together as one, in this world, this could truly be called magic. Question mark. Unbelievable, I suppose. Beatrice was speechless at the destructive power of the Pleiades battalion led by Natsuki Subaru, a group of amateurs who furiously charged into the enemy forces, crushing the well-prepared and well-armed Imperial soldiers. As the red galewind horse moved vigorously, causing the ground to rumble, a dull-bearded man named Idra held the reins, as Beatrice and Subaru rode in front of him in an awkward position. The group advancing under this banner, all under the influence of powerful yang magic. The method through which this had been achieved could only have been Beatrice, magical shroud excitation. Beatrice muttered something about a dream technique that had existed as a term for hundreds of years, yet had never been considered valuable, far from being put to practical use. Even the witch Echidna, who systematized all of magic, gave it a provisional name and left it as an ancient fantasy a technique that could not be reproduced by an individual. Magical shroud excitation was a way of forcibly manifesting a flow method, utilizing the mana circulating within the body to strengthen it, and inducing a similar effect despite a different approach to yang magic. Superhuman force was a term sometimes used to describe the breaking of one's own physical limits when facing a dangerous situation, producing power incomparable with one's original condition. That was acknowledged as a real thing in this world. In a situation of mental or physical urgency, the normally unused gates in the body could be opened, resulting in the same state of being as one who could perform the flow method. Those with superior abilities may have been able to teach themselves how to use the flow method through such an experience, but as it stood, further explanation would be omitted as it was beside the main point. Most important was the fact that magical shroud excitation was a method of forcibly bypassing human limitations, and that it was being used on the entire Pleiades battalion, which numbered in the several of thousands. Originally, Echidna had witnessed what could be called magical shroud excitation on the battlefield, being used by a small tribe of warriors who raised a battle cry which had triggered a similar effect. They continued to raise their voices before, during, and after the battle, as that was their custom on the battlefield. Their morale-inspiring yells were accompanied by a yang magic-esque effect which raised the power of the tribe as a whole, and as a result, though small in number, they had stood out in battle. However, even they were unable to resist the numerical disadvantage and disappeared in the war, alongside similar groups having been born and ground down afterwards, leaving no survivors. A group gathered at random would not produce the effect, overabundant numbers would not produce the effect, and a single competent person would not be able to reproduce the effect. Therefore, magical shroud excitation had died out without ever seeing the light of day. In modern times, only individuals of exceptional ability mastered the flow method, and shouting on the battlefield was something that only boosted courage. However, strongest. What had been shining through all the members of the Pleiades battalion who were advancing along with Subaru while shouting this, was the radiance of the magical shroud excitation that was thought to have been lost. It was truly an ideal environment, with strong trust built around Subaru, a force that equaled an army, and no one powerful enough to break the rhythm with incautious yang magic. The effects of the magical shroud excitation that had been triggered were, in yang magic terms, enhancement of the five senses, a significant increase in physical capacity, a surge in physical toughness, as well as a bewildering increase in cognitive ability, in addition to reaction time, in what could only be seen as an irregular state of multiple enhancements, in the face of the Pleiades battalion, each and every one of whom had literally become a warrior worth 1,000 warriors. The Imperial soldiers who confronted them without any prior information were overwhelmed by the momentum, as the battle lines were patently melted. Like ice hit with a hot iron, the formation the enemy had assembled melted from the front, as the group of amateurs made headway through the middle of the enemy line with frightening momentum. Even more astonishing was that Subaru, overwhelm them, but don't kill them. Make them think they stand no chance in a fight. Pleiades, oh. Pleiades, got it, boss. Pleiades, in the same way we were saved by you. In a battlefield full of people risking their lives, the leader of the advancing battalion declared that no casualties would occur. It was an idea that would be laughed off as ridiculous and childish nonsense by anyone familiar with the battlefield, but this group of wet-behind-the-ears amateurs now broke through with destructive force. Blow after blow struck the body of one Imperial soldier after the other and blew them away, but what was left behind was not a pile of corpses, but a mountain of physically and mentally incapacitated wounded. It was no tactical decision to keep the enemy soldiers alive so they would be able to rescue their fallen comrades. Rather, Natsuki Subaru simply did not have the courage to kill people. Instead of this courage, Subaru harbored a wish that was being granted by this overwhelming force. Beatrice, Subaru, how far have you thought this through, in fact? Subaru, eh? Oh, sorry everyone is being so loud. But if we are all shouting emphatically, let's do this. Let's do this. Let's do this, it gets us all hyped up. Beatrice, a tilde? That's ludicrous, I suppose. Coincidentally, Beatrice ended up voicing the shared conclusion of everyone witnessing this bizarre battlefield aloud. But there was no reason to blame them. It was a completely natural thing to say. Beatrice immediately understood Subaru's answer. Subaru, and all the people around him, knew nothing about magical shroud excitation, so there was no way that they could understand it. While they simply thought that fighting while shouting wholeheartedly made them stronger, they had actually perfectly recreated and weaponized an impossible theory even a witch had given up on. And even Beatrice was completely oblivious to the fact that Natsuki Subaru was the only one in the whole world who could turn this theory into practice with his authority of the Little King. Beatrice, that's precisely why. Subaru, Beatrice, that's precisely why you're Betty's partner, in fact. In the arms of Natsuki Subaru, who could do what nobody else could, Beatrice affirmed her situation as her depleted mana was resupplied during their long-awaited reunion. Within the Pleiades battalion, a group full of amateurs, none of whom did or needed to understand the current situation, Beatrice contemplated on behalf of her partner Subaru. How could she involve herself in this historical moment that might never be reproduced again? Beatrice, if you are intending to take the wind out of the opponent's sails, I could prevent them from reorganizing, I suppose. With a slight movement, Beatrice directed her small palm towards the large number of Imperial soldiers that had been blown away. Beatrice took into account Subaru's wishes, the bloody battles between the warring parties, as well as the Imperial way which ruled the battlefield, and with that in mind. Beatrice, El Shamak. As a member of the Pleiades battalion, Beatrice wielded her own exceedingly enhanced power. A black haze descended upon the heads of the Imperial soldiers defending the fourth bastion one after another, robbing them of their thoughts, halting their will to fight, and depriving them of the opportunity to counterattack. Within minutes of the Pleiades battalion joining the battle, the fourth bastion, which had thus far suffered minimal damage during the siege of the imperial capital, completely and utterly collapsed. The onslaught of the Pleiades battalion's unbelievable advance instantly reached the ears of Abel in the main camp. At that point, however, the name of the Pleiades battalion did not reach him, and they only reported that a group had appeared from the west and clashed with the imperial soldiers with tremendous force, collapsing the defensive line. Anyway. Good grief, they showed up just as we were about to play our trump card, and completely stole the spotlight. How exhilarating. A gallant voice echoed through the main camp as a beautiful figure leisurely arrived to accept this favorable fact. It was an imposing-looking woman swinging her wavy hair with a white sword scar. Unbefitting of her noble status, she was dressed in a garb a ruffian would favor. The name of the woman of character stepping into the main camp was Serena Drakroy. She was one of the most distinguished high countesses in the Wallachian Empire, and was currently not on the side of the Empire, but instead a rebel against the ruling power, and one of Abel's original trump cards. At Serena's visit, Abel folded his arms as he gazed out at the battlefield beyond. Abel, I was under the impression that your reinforcements would be made up of flying dragon squadrons. Serena, rest assured. I have no intention of changing the fact that the utmost elite of my forces are the flying dragon squadrons. The ones currently captivating the battlefield are an unexpected substitute. Abel, is it not by your own doing? Serena, I would put them under my wing if they approached me, but unfortunately, it seems like they're only looking up to one person. They wouldn't even bat an eye at me. As she answered, Serena's long-legged figure walked next to Abel. She looked into Abel's face with her almond-shaped eyes and narrowed her eyes at the face covered by the Oni mask. Abel, surely you cannot work with someone who hides his face from you? Serena, why would I say something so tiresome? There's no difference between those who hide their true intentions behind makeup and those who hide their true faces behind masks. If your reason is hiding a scar, I'd say you're not as bad as I am. Abel, I will not state my reason, but it is not because of a scar. I wear this out of necessity. Serena, I figured you would. I could gather from your words that you don't do anything unnecessary. And now that we've actually exchanged words like this, that impression has deepened even more. As Serena ascertained this from Abel, she smiled fiercely with her hands on her hips. Of course, as he was the emperor, Abel and Serena were acquainted with each other. The recognition blocking effect of the Oni mask could slightly alter such malaise, but it did not change Abel's evaluation of Serena. She was a fierce, progressive, and courageous general who was willing to snap at the emperor when necessary, exactly what her moniker, the Scorching Lady, suggested. However, if it were not for such a temperament, he would have never counted her as one of the cards in his hand to assist him in this rebellion. Serena, is your assessment that no one else fancies things as I do? Abel, it was necessary to think about how to prepare the grounds to win you over. But the main reason for choosing you was to increase the odds of winning the battle. Serena, when the Imperial capital only gave the cold shoulder, you appreciated my flying dragon squadron quite a bit. Serena shrugged her shoulders and sarcastically remarked this, but despite the content of her words and the expression on her face, her reaction showed that her feelings were stirred up by the fact itself. The existence of the Flying Dragon Squadron possessed by the High Countess Drakroy was the core reason why the Drakroy territory was revered and respected throughout the Walachian Empire, where the strong were held in high esteem. In other words, for Serena Drakroy, it was a source of pride that must not be harmed. Even if someone from the Drakroy territory were to commit an evil act, even if they were to act against the Emperor himself, no doubt would be brought forth against their capabilities. That was why? Abel, you have accepted the invitation on this occasion. The flying dragons that rule over the skies of the battlefield. Those who obey the Dragonkin, Madeline Ischart, force them out of the way, and claim supremacy over the air. Serena, as a matter of fact, your enticing proposal is not the only reason I accepted your invitation. But fulfilling it is also an important role for me at the moment. May you have your wish. My Flying Dragon Squadron. Abel, Serena, no longer shall those sudden reinforcements be the thorn in my eye that steals the spotlight. Having assumed the role expected of her, Serena once again directed Abel's attention to the western battlefield. Her words guided his gaze again, and his black eyes narrowed behind the Oni mask. Serena was right, that group had come as an absolute surprise to everyone. To be honest, any deviation from the path he had laid out was not welcome, no matter how favorable it might have been to the progress of battle. Serena, so that's the battalion that turned the west of the Imperial capital on its head. You have probably heard of them, haven't you? Abel, I have. However, I was unable to decipher what their purpose was, and judging from the reports of their position, they should not have made it in time for the decisive battle either. Therefore, I did not include their military potential in my estimations. Serena, in that case, they've clearly defied your expectations. From what I've heard, they've been ceaselessly running through day and night to arrive on this battlefield in time. Abel, even though such conduct makes sense in theory, it is completely nonsensical in reality. One can only imagine the amount of running a day to make it in time. And even if they made it in time after all of that, they would have way too many deserters to even put up a fight. This might be self-evident, but the more one increased the size of a group, the greater the amount of effort that was required to even get to it to move, on top of the logistics, supplies, and fighting required to maintain a large army, frenzy ensuing over time and accumulating fatigue, which easily drains the fighting spirit, slowly drives a wedge between the hoisted flag and one's heart. Even bringing someone under these conditions to a battlefield was no small feat, let alone waging war on the battlefield with them. But, Serena, so, only masked Grand General, does this look like a battle of the demoralized to you? If Serena asked him this, Abel would have to deny what he saw with his own eyes. Barely visible in the distance, the fighting of the battalion charging right into enemy lines within a whirled-up dust cloud defied all expectations. Even though their war cry could not be fully heard, its after-effects noticeably reached the main camp. Only a disillusioned fool in complete denial of reality would point at that scene and feign that the troops' morale was low. Serena, their leader, seemed to be one of the black-haired crown princes who was on everyone's lips. I thought this whole story about His Excellency Vincent's illegitimate offspring being scattered across the entire empire was laughable, but that surprisingly stands out like he could be the real deal. Abel, so that is how it is. Serena, Squinting at the lingering dust cloud in the distance, Abel's thoughts clicked into place. Serena tilted her head at Abel's remark on the story he probably already knew. But Abel did not respond to her suspicions and simply closed one eye at the arising realization within him. A group with exceptionally high morale and unity that traversed an inconceivable distance and remained on its feet just to fiercely step into this battlefield, he finally figured out its true nature. Namely, Abel, at last, I wondered if you could properly utilize your own power. If that was the case, then the unforeseen presence of the invading group from the west would make complete sense. And it would be even more unexpected for the false emperor sitting on the throne of the imperial capital. This black-haired crown prince possessed an ability that truly lived up to the rumors, or at least, that person should have been able to put on an appropriate performance. Abel, it is unnecessary for our side to make any moves on the western battlefield. However, the third bastion is still the most crucial spot to break open. And I harbor no intention to relent. High Countess Drakroy. Upon her name being called, Serena nodded her head and said, I know. Looking ahead of Abel's line of sight, she directed her gaze at the fluttering flying dragons dominating the sky. Serena, let's show His Excellency the Emperor, who appointed that crude and impudent dragonkin, the difference between wild flying dragons and the disciplined flying dragon squadron. Yes, while being completely ignorant to the fact that the true emperor stood right next to her, she undertook this mission with a rough smile on her face. Overlooking the entire battlefield from the rear, the main camp allowed them to keep a watchful eye on any anomalies all around. Having arrived there as a reinforcement, Serena Drakroy held a grudge against the flying dragons that obeyed one of the 9 divine generals, the dragonkin, Madeline Eschart. These ferocious flying dragons would never get along with humans without a special secret technique, yet they rampaged here in the battle for the imperial capital with their natural ferocity and danger on full display, posing a great threat to people. Even though Madeline only explained it roughly, she seemingly made arrangements so that the flying dragons, who could not distinguish between enemies and allies, did not cause damage to the allied imperial soldiers, and for that reason the casualties were not as indiscriminate as during the attack on the fortress city of Garrel. Nevertheless, they swooped down on the rebels to remind them of the threat of claws and fangs revolving in the sky, and the damage from the occasional stone bombardment hitting the ground could hardly be ignored. However, flying dragons could only make such attacks against warriors who attached more importance to the group rather than the individual, and could not interfere in a battle between beings with overwhelming strength. The 9 divine generals who defended each bastion and the elite of the rebels who clashed head-on with them, there was no way for the dragons to barge into a battle on an entirely higher level. Therefore, Mazoya, I am Mazoya. In accordance with the voice of mine dear child, I shalt become the wind from the heavenly skies. Emilia, icicle line. Waving both hands, Emilia jumped, redrawing a line of white ice on the world she traced. Immediately after, a tail cleaved the snowy ground where Emilia was just moments before with tremendous speed, instantly rupturing the ground and evaporating the snow. The one who did this was a mighty being with a huge body of white scales, clad in clouds flowing in the sky, called by the dragonkin, Madeline, a threat to the world swooped down upon the surface. Emilia, Mazoya. Thinking in the corner of her mind that the Wallachian Empire had a city of exactly the same name if she was not mistaken, Emilia clenched her back teeth, avoiding this powerful attack by the skin of her teeth, and took heart. Along the redrawn icicle line, an ice wall noisily rose up from the ground. It was not as high as the walls surrounding the imperial capital, but high enough to keep the flying Mazoya from escaping the battlefield. Emilia, I can't let you go where everyone else is. In the midst of a battlefield continuously getting colder, no, rather, getting chilled by her own accord, Emilia exhaled white breath while expressing her determination. Indeed, when Madeline called Mazoya, Emilia was in quite a lot of trouble. Taking on Madeline alone was already a Herculean task, but it was obvious that adding Mazoya to the equation would make things even more troublesome. But Emilia's intuition told her that she could not count on anyone to help her. Emilia, it would be nice to fight together with someone like Priscilla though. It was not Emilia's forte to fight while attuning to people around her. That was because she had trouble thinking while fighting. That was why she respected people who could think while fighting, and believed she could join forces with such a person, but even that would be difficult in this fight with Madeline and Mazoya. Emilia, because it's getting more and more cold. The ice barrier created by Icicle Line did not only prevent Mazoya from getting out, but also limited the space in which Emilia could lower the temperature. This had been a suggestion from Petra, but most ground dragons were vulnerable to cold. If flying dragons and water dragons shared the same roots as ground dragons, they might have similar weaknesses to cold. In fact, unlike earth dragons, both flying dragons, who fly high up in the skies within cooler temperatures, and water dragons, who swim through cold water, had varying tolerance levels against cold, but this misconception was irrelevant in face of overwhelming cold. Right now, Emilia brought forth such an extreme that far exceeded that limit. Emilia, this is just like Puck's magic release period. There was a time before Roswell's mansion burned down when Puck almost turned it completely to ice because his mana emission was inadvertently delayed, but the current state of the coolness of the battlefield rivaled that instance. Any normal person would have found their hands numb and unable to hold a weapon, and their body incredibly difficult to move. Even a strong person would be affected by no small amount. Precisely because Emilia chose this fighting style, she could only fight on her own. At the very least, this time. Mazoya, I am Mazoya. In accordance with the voice of mine dear child, I shalt become the wind from the heavenly skies. The sky was covered with low, thick clouds, and Emilia's amethyst eyes twinkled as she heard a voice from overhead that sounded so heavy that she wondered if the sky itself had spoken. There was a declaration of its supernatural presence, and the next moment it unleashed a blow beyond human understanding. The mere flick of its tail could rip the earth apart, the swing of its claws could split space in two, and its great breath was powerful enough to blow away nearly half a city. It was unmistakably a dragon, a legend that Emilia had now encountered twice in just a short period of time. Emilia, there was a jerk from its unfurled wings, and the wall of ice Emilia had erected was effortlessly torn apart. Although not quite on the level of iron, she had done her best to harden it. And yet, it was easily broken, and before Emilia could feel any disappointment or surprise, she was hurriedly dodging bullets of ice that came hurtling towards her. Having been cut and sent flying by its wings, countless chunks of ice, large and small, were raining down as scattered lumps. If one were to carelessly collide with this ice, some as large as one's head, one would end up completely losing their mobility against this dragon opponent. It would be a lethal injury to a diminutive being fighting a mighty dragon. Emilia, yeah. Huff. Yikes. And thus, Emilia avoided the chunks of ice as if she were dancing, sweeping away and enduring with a sword and shield of ice she had created for the ones she could not completely dodge. The fact that she never broke eye contact with her opponent was due to her recent experience of directly fighting the divine dragon Volcanica at the Pleiades watchtower. The dragon's power was so far beyond the imaginations of Emilia and her comrades that even the slightest movement that did not look like an attack could be incredibly dangerous. Emilia, when fighting Volcanica, I nearly got blown away by a puff of its nose. Remembering that time, she reaffirmed that she was glad that she had been there. If one did not know how to fight dragons, one could inadvertently fall down on the first something or other and be doomed. But that was not the only thing Emilia recalled during her fight with Mazoia. Following Madeline's call, Mazoia, the cloud dragon, pushed the sky aside and descended to the battlefield. Of course, it was very difficult to contend with the ridiculous way of fighting that was unique to dragons. Emilia, Mazoia. Please, just listen to me. I don't want to fight with Madeline. Mazoia, I am Mazoia. In accordance with the voice of mine dear child, I shalt become the wind from the heavenly skies. Emilia, just as I thought. Emilia appealed loudly, but brushing those words aside, Mazoia shook its long whiskers without listening and looked down at the tiny Emilia on the ground with its eyes. Receiving its gaze head-on, Emilia firmly gritted her teeth, keenly realizing as every nerve in her slender body was filled with energy. Namely that. Mazoia, I am Mazoia. In accordance with the voice of mine dear child, I shalt become the wind from the heavenly skies. Emilia, you're just like Volcanica, you've grown too old and have forgotten everything. For the second time in her life, she encountered a dragon, a supernatural being. Mazoia, the cloud dragon who ruled the sky, had grown senile, just like the divine dragon she encountered at the tower.